morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our, I think now, 4th annual Asia Forecast Conference. I'm Mike Green, the Senior Vice President for Asia here. And we bring together the top experts we have at CSIS and try to forecast what we should expect in the Asia-Pacific region, from political leadership transitions to black swan security events or economic events. We're glad you could join us. We're going to have you engage with us using these clickers, but not yet. Let me first do what we do now for large gatherings and just briefly give a security announcement. We're predicting the future in this conference, but if something happens during our meeting we didn't predict, fire alarm or whatever, you'll go out those doors. Obviously, this door here is also an option, both of these. It's a little crowded there, so preferable back there. And our assembly point, should we need one, is St. Mark's Cathedral on Rhode Island, or National Geographic, which is right over there. We're going to kick off today with a distinguished keynote speaker, General Robert Brown, Commander of U.S. Army Pacific. And to introduce our guest speaker, I'm going to turn to my colleague, Kath Hicks. Kath?
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Kathleen Hicks. I direct the International Security Program here at CSIS. It's so nice of all of you to join us here on finally a sunny day in Washington. But we can't boast too much about our weather to our opening keynote guest here, General Robert Brown, who's coming from Hawaii. I highly doubt we've matched that. We're very grateful that he could take time out of his limited schedule while he's in Washington to speak with us today to kick off this conference. General Brown is the Commanding General of U.S. Army Pacific. And as such, he oversees and commands 106,000 Americans that are active and reserve military soldiers, as well as Army civilians who are out in the Pacific supporting U.S. goals and objectives in the region. General Brown has, as you might imagine, an incredibly thorough history that I have promised him I will not review here for you, but suffice it to say, in addition to his extensive experience prior to this in the Pacific itself, he has worked in EUCOM, of course, in the wars overseas that we have had over the past 15 years, and notably as an educator inside the Army, training up and educating the next generation of soldiers. So, Army Strong, please help me welcome General Brown.
Well, thanks, Kathleen. It is early morning, and being an Army guy, I thought maybe we should stand up, do some jumping jacks, a little physical fitness training, get people going. But thanks for joining us, and I'm really honored to be here. I feel very fortunate that I've had just around 36 years in the military. I'm going on about 30 of those years in the Pacific, and 12 years where I was stationed in the Pacific. So from a young Captain Brown, where I actually had hair and it wasn't gray, what hair I did have, to now serving there, very privileged to serve as a commander of the U.S. Army Pacific. And as Kathleen mentioned, about 106,000 folks, and we have First Corps. And a number of units at Joint Base Lewis McChord in Washington State. We have units in Alaska. Obviously units in Hawaii, 25th Division, and then units throughout the Pacific, Japan, Guam, American Samoa, and Korea. We also have 8th Army in Korea is under U.S. Army Pacific. So we're spread out in the one of the points, the tyranny of distance is alive and well. When you look at all you have to do, I see everybody shaking their heads. If you fly in the Pacific, it seems easy. Let's just pop down to Australia, New Zealand, Japan. Boy, it's a long time in the air, particularly from here. It's a long time from the West Coast and even from Hawaii. So the tyranny of distance is alive and well out there. If you go to the first slide, I think this is a pretty interesting, I actually stole this from my boss, Combatant Commander Admiral Harris. But if you look, that circle is not even all of Pacific Command. That's just a portion of the Pacific Command, which is about 52% of the Earth's surface. And of course, for Admiral Harris, I'm the Army commander, and there's component commanders, and I've got the Army forces, as was mentioned. But in the Pacific, inside that circle, more people live inside that circle than outside that circle, which is pretty amazing. The first time I heard that, I was like, wait a minute, that can't be. You know, check that. That cannot be right. But it actually is more people inside. So if you think about the potential, well, first, some of the competition, potential resource competition, migration, security, but then also the incredible innovation and creativity within that circle. And then, interesting, by 2050, the prediction is, and it seems like a pretty solid one, 7 out of every 10 people in the world will live inside that circle. 7 out of every 10 in the world. So to me, that says quite a bit. And whenever anybody says, okay, you've got the rebalance, will the rebalance continue and all this other stuff, I just show them this and I say, you know, what do you think? I mean, it's a pretty important area, and look at the population and look at what's happening in this area. I'll talk a little bit more, no question. You know, 36 countries, 16 time zones, as we're talking again, the tyranny of distance, some 3,000 plus languages, and for us, responsibility more than half the world's surface. And it's interesting, you know, 3 of the largest economies in the world in this region. For us, what a lot of people don't know, 7 of the 10 largest armies in the world are in this region. 7 of the 10 largest in the world in this region. So, you know, you look and some people say, well, wait a minute, there's a lot of blue. What role does the Army have? Well, you know, again, 7 of the 10 largest armies, and then what we would call a mega city. You look at a city that's got 10 million people or more. This is a trend, you know, mega city trend out there. And this really surprised me, of approximately right now 36 mega cities in the world, 24 of them are in the Pacific. 24 of 36. So again, while there's a lot of blue, people live on the land, I guess except maybe somebody in a houseboat at sea or something, but and they live in these mega cities. 24 of the 36 in the world are in the Pacific, so pretty incredible. When you look also, 5 of the 7 mutual defense treaty partners the United States has are in the Pacific. 5 of the 7. Korea, Japan, Philippines, Thailand, Australia, 5 of the 7. Again, that surprises a lot of folks, and all these are reasons why there's no question the Pacific will remain a critical area. I'm glad, you know, you all are here to take a look at Pacific 2017, and it is amazing as you look. And again, in my experience, what I've seen, going back, let's say 20 years, I remember thinking, someday the Pacific is going to go from bilateral, for my experience military, very bilateral. Everything was bilateral, and we'd have these arguments, and there were those of us who said it's going to become multilateral. I don't think there'll ever be like a NATO-like organization, but it's going to move towards multilateral. And people used to say, you're crazy, there's no way, bilateral is going to remain the way. Well, as you all know, we've seen this slow, and then I've seen an increase when I was commanding 1st Corps. I started the rebalance back in 2014. From my perspective, I took over for General Scaparrotti, came back with the Corps from Afghanistan, and then it was like, okay, hey, we're now looking at how do we increase our presence, how do we increase what we do in the Pacific. And so I started to see multilateral there, but then being away a few years and coming back just last year, absolutely probably the thing that surprised me and the most is this incredible push towards multilateralism. You know, multilateral, everything we do. And I think that is kind of, in my experience, throughout the world, there's a lot more cooperation and collaboration because there's much more complex problems. Was mentioned earlier, black swans, you know, these things that come out of nowhere. When I was a younger officer, I believe, you know, you would You would consider yourself a failure if you didn't plan and predict what was going to happen. You weren't a good strategist, you weren't a good planner. You should be able to predict and figure out what's going to happen. Today, of course, that's absolutely unrealistic expectation. I think black swan is the new normal. Things that come out of nowhere and happen. And for military folks, that's quite a change. And it changes how we prepare. And, you know, instead of, again, looking at very predictable what's going to happen out there, we now look at an event coming out of nowhere and we train to where you initially might experience a little bit of failure. You didn't predict something. And then how do you recover and how do you respond? That's much different than you're training for a scenario for a year plus, you know, and then it happens. That's not the norm. The new norm is the black swan because of complexity. So let's talk a little bit about complexity when you look at the region. You know, right now there's 7 billion things connected to the internet. 7 billion. You see a little Google, you know, right there on the screen. And as you look here, back in 2003, there were certainly more people than things connected to the internet. And as you look out to 2020, where there'll be 50 billion things connected to the internet, and the things connected to the internet greatly outnumber the people that are depicted up there in the dark inner circle. So, why does that matter? Well, my gosh, that is a complete game changer, the connectivity, and no question that it leads to, if you're going to get anything done, much greater cooperation, collaboration, and again, for us, a military perspective, multilateral, moving that way away from bilateral because of the complexity and need to work together to solve some complex problems. Be that, as an example, Ebola. When Ebola hit in Africa, all of a sudden the 101st Division, famous 101st from World War II fame, was called to go over to Africa. Maybe not a military mission, but who else could organize these vast groups of people, could help isolate, could have the medical and the command and control and the ability to do this. So they went over there, and with assistance from many other nations, including a great team from China, for example, that went over of medical experts, and they all together stopped the spread of Ebola, you know, working together. That is what it is about, cooperation and collaboration in this, because it's a tough problem, and there are a lot of tough problems out there. When I think of probably the toughest, most likely problems are humanitarian assistance, disaster response in the Pacific with the Rim of Fire. I wish we could say, I think it's 7 out of every 10 people in the world killed in a disaster are in the Pacific. Because of the situation, and as we all know, the number of HADR type events that occur there. When you look, no doubt, there's also a real prosperity that has occurred and growth throughout the Pacific region. And when you look at the international norms, have enabled pretty darn good security for the past 60 plus years to enable incredible growth throughout the Pacific, many, many nations. And this growth is continuing now. The military aspect of that, and you know, the economic, you may talk about later in a different form, but for me, staying in my lane of military, what that means is the economic growth has also brought greater spending in this region, percentage of gross domestic product on defense than anywhere else in the world. You know, where there's some regions where people say countries aren't spending enough, they're spending quite a bit. In fact, I think 6 of the top 10 arms importers in the world are in the Pacific. 6 of the top 10 arms importers in the world are in the Pacific, and 6 of the top 10 largest defense budgets are in the Pacific. So this prosperity is leading to great economic growth, but then also it impacts in the military lane and spending in defense as well. When you look at, for us, go to the next slide, if you will, we have challenges out there. So I thought you'd get a kick out of that one. You know, there are challenges. I was recently over in China for the 12th iteration of a disaster management exchange between the Chinese Army and the U.S. Army, a 12th iteration. I'll tell you, it was fantastic. I had an amazing visit. I was over there about 10 days. And you know, my old National War College professor, Dr. Bud Scholl, is here. My first trip to China was with him as a student at National War College back in 2001, and I just loved it. This trip was just incredible. And what was interesting, we concentrated on what we had in common. I talked about the Flying Tigers in World War II, where we actually had U.S. pilots flying in the Chinese Air Force, and we worked together so closely. I talked about Ebola, the example from Ebola, and many other HADR and peacekeeping operations, other things we had in common. But it was interesting because when I spoke at the National Defense University, the first 5 questions were all differences, as you can imagine. Things like South China Sea, et cetera. Probably some of you are waiting to ask me that here when I'm done, you know. But what I would say is very important. We have to find what we have in common is the most important, so you can talk about the differences. If you just talk differences, you're never going to get past that. And I use an example from my experience deployed, totally different, but an experience in northern Iraq, a city called Mosul's in the news quite a bit today. I spent a couple years there. One of my jobs when I was a deputy commanding general is to bring the Kurds and Arabs together so we could have a joint election, and we could, you know, we had disputed territories and trying to bring the Kurds and Arabs together. And we had a governor in Mosul and Nineveh province who had run on an anti-Kurd campaign. An Arab governor ran on an anti-Kurd campaign, and he would not even talk to the governor next door in Erbil, wouldn't even talk to him. And it was actually, the conversations were like, there's no way I'm going to talk, and he just kept hounding on the differences and historical differences and disputes they had had. Well, after several months of working, and I got them together to meet each other and talk things in common. And it was amazing, because he was like, wait a minute, he has the same concerns I do. He wants a brighter future for his family. He wants peace and stability. And of course, I was sitting there thinking, what did you think? You know, it was going to be this crazy wild man. You're going to get in a fist fight or something. And they got along very well. We started to get them together, started working together. Joint security, joint checkpoints. Ironically, after we left and ISIL came into Mosul, that governor, Najafi, where did he go? Erbil. And the Kurds protected him, and he's been there for several years. And now, as forces are going back in Mosul, Najafi is going back to Mosul to take back over as the governor with the Kurds. So here's an individual would not even talk. Arab, Kurd, too many differences. We found things in common. They talked their differences, and lo and behold, they have helped him. So I brought up that example when I was in China, and we saw teams of soldiers working together extremely well in humanitarian assistance, disaster response, and as I mentioned, it was the 12th iteration. So I put this picture up because there are challenges. I mean, I'm not going to be naive and say everything's wonderful. You know, there are differences. But, you know, competition isn't conflict. You know, there's competition, there's different, and we've got to work through it. And I think we have to find, I know Army to Army, we find a lot of things in common, and find those things in common so we can discuss the differences. Okay, next slide. As you look, and by the way, you see Putin up there, Russia is in the Pacific as well. So when you look at the Pacific, 4 of the 5 challenges that our folks identify are in the Pacific. The thing that keeps me up at night, though, the thing I worry the most about is North Korea. The most likely threat to all of us sitting here, in my opinion. You have a belligerent North Korea, where he's pushing the envelope. I mean, look at 34 plus launches in 4 years, depending how you count it. It can be upwards of 40, depending on what you count, versus his father, 12 launches in 17 years. You know, there's something going on there, and there's this belligerent aggressiveness. Now, you know, the sanctions are fantastic, folks working together, but I do worry about most likely threat, North Korea, because obviously every soldier that I lead, every individual that I'm in charge of would be involved, would be there, some within hours, some are already there on the peninsula, and some would move that direction very quickly. And I have significant responsibilities, things like non-combatant evacuation operations on the peninsula and getting several 500,000 people out of there, minor little things that are easy. So those type challenges. So I do worry about that. There's just so many things in the 21st century. The only individual to test a nuclear weapon, conduct a nuclear test, and just as we see the aggressive action that's occurring. So we do prepare the most and consistently in training for this threat, and it is the biggest concern. Of course, there's also in the region, unfortunately, extremist ideology. And as you look, ISIL being squeezed out of Middle East and other areas is moving into the region. For us, it's something that all of us, again, all our nations here, we're going to be dealing with extremist ideology for a long time. This is not going to go away tomorrow. We'll be dealing with this a long time. We have that in the Pacific as well, so additional challenge. The only challenge we don't have in the Pacific is Iran, but all the other challenges I just mentioned, and again, North Korea, the one that will keep me up at night. But then the other one I mentioned earlier, when you talk about most likely thing that will occur, is a humanitarian assistance disaster response. And that's something, again, we work very closely, many exercises together so we can respond better as a military, all our nations working together to save lives. And that's something we consistently do. If you look at any disaster that's occurred, some of them so complex when you look back to the earthquake, tsunami. We had a team from Japan come over, and we were talking lessons learned from that event. And it was interesting. They said if you would have had an exercise that said there's going to be an earthquake, leads to a tsunami and a potential nuclear disaster, they said, oh, people wouldn't believe you. Come on, let's be realistic. Don't make up all this stuff. And lo and behold, it happens again, black swan, kind of out of nowhere. Even with HADR, whether it's climate change or what, I don't know, but something's happening and we're seeing these disasters. So working together is just critical with that. I think for us, this incredible move you see up there on the screen, that's one exercise, and we spend a lot of time working together. Most likely the HADR, and then preparing for those black swans mentioned earlier, and those black swans could include something that North Korea does or something comes out completely out of nowhere. So that's a good example up there of 30 plus nations working together in an exercise, and this is happening all over the Pacific, very, very consistently. So, we are always looking how we work closer together, trying to find, again, those things in common to get after talking about differences and understanding better. And I think one thing I would say in my 30 plus years in the Pacific, of my 36 years in the military, I have never seen stronger ties throughout the region. And it's leading to that multilateralism, particularly with our treaty partners, no question, but then also other ties growing. And so for me, that's extremely encouraging when you look at the more you can do stuff together, the more you can understand each other, the better off you are moving towards finding those things in common so you can at least discuss differences and they will not become the focus that may lead to unintentional conflict or issues, if you will. So I think with that, we've got a session with questions. I'm sure there's lots of questions out there. Again, I thank you for coming. It looks like most everybody stayed awake, is pretty motivated, so we didn't need the physical fitness portion of it. But if you maybe afterwards you want to come out back, we can do some push-ups and jumping jacks, all that, if you feel so motivated. But I'm just very glad to be here. I welcome you if you're out in the Pacific. Folks here, stop by Pacific Command, and we're very fortunate in that we're the only combatant command in the world where all the components and the headquarters are all together, located together. And it helps us really work closely together, just physically being located together, Navy, Air Force, Army, Marines, Special Ops, and our headquarters, the Combatant Command, all together and working many similar issues. So as we move forward, that cooperation together and collaboration is absolutely critical for these tough challenges that are out there. So I look forward to your questions. I think Kathleen's going to come on up. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, General Brown. That was a great overview of the challenges and opportunities in the Pacific. Let me start with something very broad-ranging, which is, you talked a bit about the implications for the Army, but if I can put it in a more pointed way, that's quite a range of missions to prepare the Army for in the Pacific. Obviously, we have strains on the defense budget. Frankly, we'll always have strains on the defense budget. In other words, there's always more mission that we can imagine as people who seek to reduce risk than there is budget. But we do seem to feel particularly constrained right now. So what are the keys that you are focusing your command around in order to optimize at the right points on the spectrum and be ready for those black swans that might arise?
Yeah, it's a great question, Kathleen, thanks. What we found is my number one priority has to be readiness. And having done this, as I mentioned, about 36 years, you have to, as a military leader, you have to prepare those you lead for the worst thing they may face. There are a lot of things, I remember when I was a younger officer, it's kind of like, well, we may be doing, the most likely, as I mentioned, a humanitarian assistance disaster response, so why wouldn't we spend the most time on that? Well, you spend time on that, but you've got to prepare for the worst thing that may happen. Kim Jong-un does something stupid and they attack South tomorrow. My soldiers will be there. I have to prepare them for that, and that's a tough, demanding training that would occur. Not saying humanitarian assistance disaster response isn't tough, but it's not quite as demanding, as complex. And so you prepare for the most complex thing you will face. And you only have so much time, and resources are always a challenge. And so readiness is our number one priority, and we consistently are training the toughest. Now, we have some advantages in that. We have tremendous training areas throughout the Pacific. We have very clever, creative ways to train, such as Pacific pathways. We used to go to an exercise and come back in a way, quite honestly, not the way we would deploy if we had to do it for real. So Pacific Pathways, we do the deployment the way we would for real. We move the equipment by ship. We move the soldiers, and we face the complexities of deployment, coordination, challenges with coordinating with different combatant commands, Transcom, Stratcom, different nations. Much different to go into a port in Malaysia than the Philippines, than Australia, than Japan. All different. And you have to, and if you can talk about it all you want, that you can get there and help and be there when needed, but until you practice it. So Pacific Pathways actually does practice it the right way, and it practices all those elements, the complex command and control. So that's a pretty clever thing we've done, where you're really training for where the scrimmage, if you will, is tougher than the actual event. Very, very important. And you don't want the training to be easier. It's got to be tougher, and so we consistently work that. We also have our combat training centers, extremely important to us. We have National Training Center in the desert, California. I was there last week watching 125 Stryker Brigade combat team, a brigade out of Alaska, and they're facing a world-class OP4 and a tough, demanding. I used to command that unit, and I was saying, boy, thank God I'm not going through this rotation. It's a lot tougher than when I was doing it, and maybe I'm just older and I remember it being easier, I don't know, but it's pretty darn tough. And watching them go through that, so you're training at the highest level, and now they're ready, they're at the highest level of readiness, ready should, God forbid, something happen, they can execute what they need to, be it a disaster response, or again, if North Korea should do something stupid, they're ready. And I've also found incredible incentive as a leader You know, in the past, when you've had to go into harm's way and send your soldiers into harm's way, you have to be able to look those parents in the eye and say, I've done everything I can do to prepare your son or daughter. We owe that to those soldiers, those families. I have a personal interest in that as well, because my oldest daughter's in her 11th year of service, deployed multiple times. She's a captain, and I have 2 son-in-laws who are serving, and about 8 years and 12 years. So there's a real investment there beyond even just my responsibilities as a commander.
Now, one area on that threat spectrum that gets a lot of needed focus these days is what some people will call hybrid or gray area. And before, to be country before country was cool. It used to be called provocations, I think we called it, for North Korea. So they've been at it a long time. So whatever the nomenclature you want to use, the focus in the Pacific, again, has largely been North Korean provocations, typically missile-related, and then in the South and East China Sea, the Chinese maritime and air activity. But as you point out, there's a lot of land and there's a lot of big armies in the Pacific. What do you try to focus on or make sure that leaders are thinking about that is in this area of provocations, short of conventional war, where, of course, you have to train and be optimized to that, but where the U.S. Army might find itself with a role?
Yeah, this is, when I was talking about how complex the world is, this is an area where you see folks have, leveraged technology in many cases to be in this gray zone where it's not quite war, it's not quite conflict. And so things are occurring, and you really have to, as you're looking at that, I don't like the term, some in the military, we had these phases. That's kind of old think, actually. Phase 0 is the phase where you're not in conflict and you're doing exercise and so forth. I think phase 0 is a terrible term because it implies that there's nothing really happening in that phase. It's not important. I think that's the most important phase. And we would look at that phase is where you set the conditions, and hopefully, if you do it right, you avoid conflict in phase 0. And so these gray zone, you have to be able to react to what's happening in a positive way and have the training and the ability to not let it escalate, not let it become, a conflict. And as I mentioned, what's interesting is, particularly in some of this gray zone stuff, folks will concentrate solely on the differences in the gray zone. I think if you're involved and engaged, and again, multilateral solutions, you can get inside that gray zone and prevent it from escalating, and prevent it. You have to have the right strategic messaging, and you have to have the capability. You can't be a paper tiger, deterrence. You've got to have the ability to deter somebody. So you've got to have that training I talked about earlier, and folks know that you have a capable, competent, trained, ready organization, or you don't have much say when you're trying to reduce tension in these gray zone areas. It kind of goes hand in hand with the black swan idea of some of the gray zone events come fast and they come out of nowhere. And so the other aspect of that, you have to train that, and those are put into some of the scenarios I talked about at our training centers. You'll face some of that in our training we do. So your training, some of the older leaders in the military would say we need to go back to the basics, but the basics have changed, and one of those changes is this gray zone area. Mm-hmm.
And as I mentioned earlier, you have been a leader in training and educating the future leadership of the Army. What skill sets do you think, not just for gray area, but the challenge set for the future, where do you think the U.S. military broadly, and certainly the Army, need to go in terms of skill sets for
and
challenges?
That's a great question. I think it applies not just military. This applies business, sports. The complexity of the world, do you want to be a victim of complexity or master complexity? And, the things are only continuing to get more complex. So as we saw a changing world about 14, 15 years ago, I remember leaders were saying, you need to be comfortable in ambiguity and chaos. And it was, for us in the military, General McChrystal was really and I thought he was spot on. Things were changing, they were different. You had to learn to be comfortable. Well, as we look now into the future, comfort does not win. You need to thrive. When you're looking at ambiguity and chaos, you need leaders that thrive in ambiguity and chaos. And again, that applies in business. That applies in the military, leaders that thrive in ambiguity and chaos. And so how do you get them there? It's a different way to select. It's a different way, more rigorous education, more emphasis on leadership development. For us, that's one thing I'm extremely proud of. For example, you look at the U.S. military, our people are our advantage. The people. And what's happened, we've seen over time, and kind of lived it in my lifetime, is kind of fascinating. We went from a very, years, 50 plus years of our command philosophy was command and control. And I remember when I was a younger officer, you could stand there, go left, go right, do this. Things could go all the way up the chain of command and all the way back down. You could have very good control. That's gone. And so in 2008, in the middle of 2 wars, we switched to mission command, which is all about empowerment. Now, my last job, I was working that leadership development and mission command. I was responsible for it, my last job at the Combined Arms Center at Leavenworth. And we actually wrote the first ever doctrine on leadership development. We'd had it tucked into other doctrine, but we'd never written. Manual 622 was all about developing leaders and teams, and today how you get to where you thrive. And so it was fascinating to be involved in that, and then also involved in, for example, in the Army, we have really significantly improved the rigor in our education, and we developed what we call Army University. So all of our schools are tied in, and it will significantly improve the education to our soldiers, from private to general. And a really great look at that. And in all of that, we're looking at how do you educate, how do you train for folks who can thrive in ambiguity and chaos, because that's what you need in the future. And so in the middle of 2 wars in 2008, we switched from command and control to mission command, where you empower people. And you have to in today's world. And as I mentioned in that last job, I also got to go out and speak to a lot of different organizations, and a lot with business. It was very interesting because what I found, many major businesses are struggling with that empowerment, that mission command. I'm pretty proud in the military, we've figured that out, how to empower and how to get because the best ideas will come from the edge, the cutting edge, those closest to the problem. I've seen that over and over again in combat and peacetime and HADR. The best ideas are from those closest to the problem, but can they get back to the leadership? Do they have a voice back? Are they empowered, or are they, and a lot of businesses are struggling with that. Very interesting. So I found that's something that military-wise we're way ahead of, and it's an advantage for us, our people that can be empowered.
And we were talking back a little bit before about Pacific Pathways maybe being an example of that kind of thinking at the edge that's brought in. I do want to talk about opportunities, and in particular India. Love to get your thoughts on how you see India as an actor in the region is shifting over time, and how you are reacting to that or taking advantage of that.
That's a great question. I was fortunate enough to go to India representing Department of Defense with Secretary Kerry about, I guess it was 6-7 months ago. It seems like yesterday. But it was a great experience, and I presented the defense portion of our cooperation working together. There was an economic portion, and really significant for us recently is a logistics agreement with India that was signed, and so we can do things a lot easier. We've always had a great relationship with the Indian military. For me, my experience, Indian Army, we've had a tremendous relationship, but sometimes we were slowed down by normal bureaucracies and so we're working through that, and it's very encouraging to me. It's the greatest cooperation I've seen, and the whole of government approach to cooperate closer. So that's helping us, where before we'd want to do things, but something that you think would be done in a month would take years. Literally years. Now we're not seeing it. We're seeing things happen faster, and we're continuing to increase our exercises with India, all the services, and they're a key player in the region, obviously, and so it's really great. And they have a tremendous army for us, and we, working with them is a real honor. And then to be over there and to see the whole of government was really fascinating. So that's growing. I don't see that going anywhere but positive and forward and continuing to grow.
Okay, I want to open it up to the audience for questions. We have microphones that will come around, and when I call on you, please give your name, your affiliation. It is one question, and it is a question, please. So we'll start right here in the front, and the microphone is coming.
Yeah. I'm Kumar from Amnesty International. General, the question is about South China Sea. Recently, during the confirmation hearing, Secretary of State nominee Tillerson mentioned that one of the options to deal with that is to blockade the islands. If that scenario plays out, what are the challenges you face? Because you'll be definitely facing Chinese military. Thank you.
No, thanks, sir. But I go back to what I stated earlier, as I kind of anticipated. I was hoping the first question would maybe be something in common. And not necessarily, again, looking at differences. There are clearly differences in South China Sea. The good thing for me in my Army lane, I don't run into that a lot, and I have a great relationship with the PLA Army because of we don't have some of those concerns. But we are all about following the international norms, and freedom of navigation is very, very important. And what's interesting is, with this difference in the South China Sea, when you look back, as I mentioned, I think what's very interesting is the prosperity in the Pacific is because of freedom of navigation and the security that's been provided 60-plus years. So we encourage everyone to work through these challenges using the international norms and rules of law as they're dealing with all these scenarios. And that's how we address those challenges.
Great. We're going to come over here in the front, and the microphone is coming.
Hi, Sidney Friedberg, Breaking Defense. Long time no see.
Sidney and I were together yesterday, and it was great. I was jealous of his hair. As you can see, I was, I wish I had that problem of that much hair,
I tried to beat him to submission this morning. It didn't cooperate. But on the subject of things that are stubborn and don't necessarily cooperate or all line up, you mentioned multilaterals increasing. You mentioned, India, which has always been in a very careful, balanced position, being more receptive, more cooperative. Can you go into some more specifics of things that, maybe 10 years ago, you as an officer working in the Pacific would have said, nah, it's not going to happen, and now are starting to happen or even becoming routine? And second, what is driving that change? Well, obviously, people are worried about China is one thing that keeps coming up.
No, it's a great question, Sidney, and so thanks. And I would say that the number one is we just had, I was privileged enough to be a part of the first trilateral discussions between Australia, U.S., and Japan. It was about 5 years ago when I was First Corps Commander. 10 years ago, I would have never thought we would get together in a trilateral forum and discuss all these, at length, these issues. Multiple exercises that before, if it's humanitarian assistance, disaster response, 10 years ago, lots of people participated, no issue. But if it was something else, dealing with North Korea, for example, people would walk on eggshells, they wouldn't participate. Now they participate, and they want to. Dialogue, really healthy dialogue. I mentioned we have the responsibility for non-combatant evacuation operations. 10 years ago, it was difficult to get the Republic of Korea, the ROCs, and Japan to talk about things like NEO. Now it's normal. It occurs and consistently. And so, and some of it, you're right, Sidney, is driven by, I believe, the complexity in the world. The humanitarian assistance disaster response are more complex than they were 10 years ago. Again, I don't know what's going on there, but they seem to be more and much more complex when they do happen, and a greater loss of life, and that's sad. And then exercises are more complex. The world is more complex. So some of it is driven by competition and fear. So it drives people to be more multilateral. Some of it is driven by this complexity. It forces you to handle these tough, complex problems. You have to work together more. You know, I was going to use the example, you know, of when I first came on board, I was thinking, boy, I want to do even more multilateral. And you know, certain nations, some of the agreements aren't finalized, but I would just say in general, nations that 10 years ago I wouldn't even have talked to about multilateral. I was wondering how will they respond, and when I brought up we'd like to do multilateral, maybe Australia, Japan, US, and your nation involved, and they're like, yes, we're very interested. Whereas 10 years ago, they would have said, no, let me think about it. No, let's just keep it bilateral. Now they're moving that way. But that's about 6 or 7 nations. And there, none of it's finalized yet, so I don't want to be specific and cause to throw it, you know, out of line. But that wouldn't have done that before. And then other things, I've met with them. I've been about 9 months in the position. Met with 26 countries, and what I find is 10 years ago you wouldn't have had people volunteer for Pacific Pathways as an example, where I mentioned very innovative exercise, multiple nations. Every nation I've met with said, can we do a Pathways? Can you do a Pathways where we are? 10 years ago, they wouldn't have done that. Every one of the 26 I've met with have a Pathways. And in some cases, we have what's called reverse pathways, where they come, they pay for it and come to train with us, like Japan coming to train in Washington State, or Singapore right now is at the National Training Center, and I saw them last week training with that brigade I mentioned from Alaska. That wouldn't have happened 10 years ago like it is now. So those would be the examples I'd use, Sydney. So.
Okay, we have time for probably 2 more questions, so let's go. We have one over here, and then I'll group them, and we'll have you answer.
Kelsey Roderick, Eurasia Group. Thanks for speaking with us today, General. You mentioned North Korea as one of the biggest security threats in 2017. I'm wondering if you also see terrorism as an increasing threat, particularly in Southeast and South Asia, with the return of ISIS fighters. And if so, if you could speak to the capacity of these Asian states to deal with the threat and the potential role for the U.S. Army. Thanks.
Yeah.
Hold your thought. I'm sorry, because just for time purposes, I'll get one more question, and then we'll go for it. I have one way in the back over here. Yep.
Paul Murphy, Gowling WLG. First of all, General, thank you for your service.
Oh, thanks.
But going back to the Cold War, we've always used our technological advantage as a force multiplier. How do you evaluate that technological advantage today in the Asia-Pacific region? Do you see the gap closing? And how do you adjust for that or recover the lost gap if there is one? Thank you.
Great question, thanks. Let me start with that one, just because I'm old and I remember it easier. But that's a great question. That is one thing that's changed when we talk about complexity. Look at technology and the spread of technology. I mean, I remember, you know, again, 20 years ago when I was a much younger officer, and we used to say we owned the night. We were the only ones that could see at night, and it was a key thing. Well, you know, those type advantages are long gone. If you want technology, you can buy it on the internet. You can buy an unmanned aerial system, you can buy night vision, you can buy technology, you can copy technology easier, you can 3D print stuff, even you know, out in the field. So I mean, technology, obviously every military, you'd be foolish not to want the best technology, but the technological advantage that, you know, we or any other nations may have had will only last so long. And you can't rely on that technological advantage. So that's why I go back to the people. It's technology, as I see the third offset, as we're, you know, talking in our Department of Defense, is technology that leverages people. Leverages people to make decisions faster, leverages people to understand, you know, the fog of war has changed. And again, this applies to business, where you call it the fog of business. Used to be, you know, 20 years ago, it was not enough information. You know, when I was young, you'd get one or two pieces of information. Quite honestly, it was easier for us as young leaders. You used to have a saying, do something, do anything, Lieutenant, you know, do something. And nobody would critique you because you only had one or two pieces of info, so no big deal. Now, what's the fog of war or business? What is it?
Too much information.
Too much information, by far. You're overwhelmed. I mean, just look at your email compared to snail mail. You know, I mean, how about you? But I get about 150 emails a day, and not to mention to keep up with, you know, my granddaughters, I got to be on, you know, I don't know, Doug, on Instagram, Twitter, YouTube. I don't know how you have time to keep up with all this stuff. Of course, I'm an old digital immigrant, but it amazes me, like when my oldest granddaughter, when she was 4, she could do more on an iPhone than I will ever be able to my entire life. And then what I found was fascinating, she would be calling up, let's say, you know, Dora the Explorer to watch it. And if it was delayed 5 seconds, she'd be frustrated. And I'm thinking, oh my God, I was happy for black and white TV, whatever was playing. And now a 4-year-old is frustrated waiting 5 seconds. Complexity in the world has changed and technology has changed. And it's got to be technology that leverages people. There are some things, I know we all read about, oh, artificial intelligence is going to do it all, robots are going to fight the future wars. I would totally, artificial intelligence will be involved, certainly. Helping people make decisions faster will be key. But there are some things artificial intelligence and machines will never have, like empathy and the right judgment in a situation. And so I believe that human beings will always have to be. Now, some others may say, well, no. Some other nations may say no. Maybe they have a different set of standards. But I don't think we'll ever have human beings will always be key. But that technology that leverage them is critical. So that's how you cannot rely on technology the same way as we did in the past. And the people are who must be developed, and the investment in people. Something else business is learning, and we've known for a long time. Leadership development, education, very, very important, so you can empower those people to make those decisions and leverage that technology. That's the advantage. Now, getting back to the question over here on terrorism, you're absolutely right. I mentioned North Korea, but probably the most likely, and I think you're spot on, is a terrorist event happening, you know, unfortunately, somewhere in the Pacific. Well, I would put it's probably a competition between a humanitarian assistance disaster and a terrorist event is most likely to occur, no question. But when I look at, you know, most likely military, larger scale is North Korea, but the terrorism is a concern. And as they are being squeezed out of other parts of the world, they're moving into the Pacific region, because the Pacific is vast, as we were talking about earlier, and you can hide there. You can sort of disappear. And there are, I saw the other day, a count of 31 plus extremist groups who have pledged to ISIL in the Pacific region, spread out all over. This is a real challenge. We work with other militaries in how to counter the terrorist threat. The force that does it the most is our Special Operations. Our Special Operations Command Pacific, General Fenton, is consistently working to help other militaries. How do you deal with this threat? But we work with it as well. For example, in U.S. Army Pacific, we have a counter IED fusion cell that works with other nations of how do you counter IEDs, because they have appeared and are appearing more and more around the world and in the Pacific. So this is a really important thing and one of the key ties and to other militaries, and it's probably the most popular thing they ask for. But maybe humanitarian assistance disaster response is first. It's a close second. These countries asking for it. It is not going to go away. I wish I could say we won't have to worry about this type thing a couple years from now. It's going to be around a long time, unfortunately, and that's really sad, but we all have to learn how to deal with it, what to do, and how to counter it, because it's going to be here a long time. We'll be dealing with it for a long time. So anyway, thanks. Great questions.
General Brown, thank you so much for sharing your time with us today, and thank you for leading those 106,000 soldiers and civilians who are helping to secure our interests in the Pacific. I know the rest of the day will focus across the range of issues, but on the security side, you've really helped us focus our energies. So everyone, please join me in thanking you.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you, General Brown. That was an excellent oversight and laid out the comprehensive challenges and the opportunities, and then took a deep dive on how the Army is getting ready for what will be an increasingly, as we heard, complex operating environment for them, as it will for diplomats and business leaders as well. We're going to have 3 panels forecasting. The first will be led by Matt Goodman. The title is Who Will Write the Rules of Trade in Asia? And the answer is Scott Kennedy and Scott Miller, or at least they're going to start to anticipate the answer to the question. The second panel is on leadership. We called it With Friends Like These, Leadership Transitions. Victor Cha was going to moderate that one. I'm going to moderate it so that we can ask Victor hard questions about the Korean election. And Amy Seawright, our Southeast Asia director, and Andrew Shearer, head of our Alliances project, will join me. And then the last panel, which I'll also moderate, is on security, and we're really going to focus in on the maritime security challenges in the Pacific with Zach Cooper and Bonnie Glazer. We'll have you use these clicker questions. Can we test it now, Will? Okay, so let's do that. Just to get, as the general said, readiness is everything, training. So we're going to do one practice run and then move to the rest of the program. So make sure your power's on. And there's a power button. And these will be multiple choice generally. And as you vote, it'll move up and down as people change their minds or figure out how the clicker works. The question we're practicing on is in 2017, Washington will give Asia A, more attention, B, the same amount of attention, or C, less. And we'll let you click for a while, and then Will lock it. And then we're going to turn to the panels and have them answer the questions and discuss it. And you guys, you did pretty well, although I'm not sure everyone's clicking. So make sure your clicker's on. And almost evenly divided. More attention, the same amount of attention, less attention. The case for more attention, the general laid out pretty well. Over half of Americans think Asia is the most important region to our future. Over 80% of millennials think that. But we're a little consumed with ourselves these days, and certainly in Washington. And the history of our Asia strategy and Asia policy has been a history of us, the United States, getting distracted by pressing events in other parts of the world. Which are perhaps less important in terms of business, population, shaping the dynamism of the world, but they're more dangerous and scary. 70% of Americans say that the Middle East is the most scary part of the world, and they're probably right. So we'll see. Maybe we'll do this vote at the end of the panel. Thank you. Now, before we go to the first panel that Matt is going to chair, I wanted to very briefly give you a thumbnail sketch of the projects we're doing in 2017 to try to get ahead of some of these trends. We, like all our colleagues around town, are constantly monitoring and analyzing and testifying on developments, but we have a couple of signature projects I want to flag for you briefly. And maybe after we do this event and do the clickers and people vote, we might change this a bit or add more. But here's what we have planned by program. The Freeman Chair, which Chris Johnson heads in China Studies. Chris is in Beijing today in a super secret meeting and won't be with us, but Scott Kennedy, his deputy, is. The Freeman Chair is focusing in particular on 2 signature topics, the China Innovation Policy Series, which Scott runs, which takes a deep dive into 6 areas of emerging industry in China, like semiconductors, new generation vehicles, artificial intelligence, and does a kind of political assessment or political economy assessment of how regulations and so forth are affecting innovation. So deep empirical dive and then trying to draw some conclusions that will help business, government. And this is the year of China's 19th Party Congress. So Chris and Scott and others have a series of publications and events making sense of the 19th Party Congress, which Scott will address in the second panel. The Japan Chair, which I also had, has a lot going on, but there are a couple events that are the culmination of some work we've been doing. On the 21st of February, we're putting out 2 books with multiple authors from Japan and around the world. And these are books that look at the 20th century and how Japan's experience before 1945 and after 1945 looks in comparison to how other countries see their history, India, Germany, and so forth. Sort of put this in context. We were asked to do this actually as Prime Minister Abe was preparing his own 70th anniversary statement to provide sort of a global context. And the second book is on Japan's post-war history and what to make of it 7 years later. We have our annual U.S.-Japan Security Seminar here March 23rd, which is a signature event, used to be in San Francisco, that brings together the senior alliance managers and experts around town to make an assessment of our alliance. And we have a conference in June, excuse me, with the Simon Chair. We do every year with JETRO, the External Trade Organization, which is kind of like this, but focusing just on trade and architecture and finance and investment in the Asia-Pacific region. The Korea Chair, led by Victor Cha, has a lot of events. You'll see Victor's focusing on human rights issues in particular recently. The Korea Chair leads on the U.S. side for a number of major bilateral 1.5 and second track dialogues with Jungang Ilbo, the newspaper, with President Park Geun-hye's Northeast Asia Peace and Cooperation Forum, so-called NAPSI, and so forth. On the internet, the thing Victor and company are doing that's very exciting and a little bit risky is called Beyond Parallel, and it's really an effort to look inside North Korea at trends in stability, human rights, society, using some innovative methods, surveys even within North Korea, to try to make sense of that. It's called Beyond Parallel. And then our Southeast Asia program, led now by Amy Seawright, is doing a series of projects on the South China Sea, on ASEAN. Amy and a team will be in Manila in a brainstorming session with ASEAN representatives, and also monitoring developments in Myanmar and the domestic political transitions, which Amy will talk about if her voice is working. She's getting over a cold. Rick Rosso is in India, I think, but he runs our Wadhwani chair in U.S.-India Policy Studies. Rick, if you're an India hand, has a support from the State Department and private sector to do a very deep dive in the Indian states. Dealing with the Indian central government on economic issues can be really frustrating, and the competition between Indian states and the relative innovation and obstacles to investment and trade within Indian states is really where the action is. And in Washington, we've never had a way to talk about that or monitor that. So he's created a platform that will allow even sort of armchair Indiawalas like me to understand it and to track it. Scott Miller runs the Scholl Chair in International Business. His website, Trade Vistas, really unpacks the politics and economics of trade policy. And Scott, together with Matt, helped produce a bipartisan strategy on economic engagement in the Asia Pacific. The election made that a little more interesting. So I suspect they'll be updating and adjusting and continuing to make the case for a strong U.S. economic strategy in the Pacific. Matt, also in the Simon Chair, is studying bamboo. Growth, and focused on growth. And he has a really cool website called Reconnecting Asia, which looks at the investment in the so-called Silk Road, or Inner Asia, the reconnections, which are characterized or featured in China's One Belt, One Road, in the Asia Development Bank and World Bank projects, in Japanese, Korean, and Indian ideas. We're monitoring it. The U.S. doesn't have a major infrastructure program for Central Asia, but everyone else's affects our interests in terms of security and economics. And so it's the first real effort to start mapping that series of disconnected infrastructure investments and try to draw some conclusions or lessons in terms of the economic seriousness of these, the security implications and so forth. Andrew Shearer, the former National Security Advisor in Australia, has joined us and is leading a project on alliances, which asks why are alliances important and what do we get out of them? A pretty important question right now, at least one to answer. How can burden sharing and effectiveness and output of alliances be improved? And how can we build domestic political support for alliances? The outgoing president, the incoming president have raised some questions about our alliances, mostly in Europe, but in Asia as well. And so Andrew's project is going to begin to assess what we get, what we don't get, but also start looking at the mechanics very specifically in a series of roundtables we'll do on technology cooperation, command and control, and so forth. We've had for a while now the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, which Greg Poling heads, which you're probably familiar with. We get a lot of press on this, but we're monitoring developments in maritime Asia, and in particular the South China Sea, using a combination of commercially available footage, our own analytics, and a team of experts across the region, including China, Philippines, and so forth, to anticipate, look for, and then analyze things like the buildup in the South China Sea. And last but not least, Bonnie Glaser has started a new website called China Power Project, which was really ambitious and is working, and that's to try to unpack the sources of Chinese power. There's no absolute answer about how powerful China really is in soft power or military power, but this gets the analytics, the data we can look at, and gets experts to assess what's real, what isn't, what to watch. And in addition to that, of course, Bonnie's doing a lot of work on South and East China Sea, Taiwan, which she'll talk about when we're on stage. So that's just a brief introduction, and as I said, we may, depending on your clicker questions, decide that there's some other things we should probably be adding to this mix, and we invite you all to join us. Okay, so Matt, you're going to chair the first panel and tell us who's going to write the rules of trade, and that's Scott Miller and Scott Kennedy. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Matt Goodman, and as Mike said, I run the Simon Chair, and delighted to start with economics, which is, not usually the pattern, but I think these days appropriate. And so I'm delighted with my colleagues Scott Miller and Scott Kennedy, who I guess Mike has already told you about and what they're working on. Happy to tell you more about that, but we are going to talk about trade in this session. These are bracing times for those of us following trade. I was saying to Victor earlier that we, all of us working in the policy world, always want attention to what we're working on, especially from the president. It's very cool when the president is interested in what you're working on. I think right now, maybe some of us would prefer not to have quite so much attention on this topic from the commander-in-chief, but he's obviously got very strong views on trade and has laid out already a very different approach to one that we're sort of used to here, so we're all kind of grappling with that. And we're gonna try to get into that and hear your views on this set of issues as well. I could say more, but I think I'm going to leave it there and just maybe ask the two Scotts quickly before we put up the questions and ask you specifically what you think. Just to ask before we look forward, Scott Miller. Talk about the last year and sort of what's been going on in trade and trade policy and how we got to the point we're at today.
Well, I think the one thing you can say about trade policy in the last year is it had a trajectory that was fairly easy to plot. In fact, it was 51 weeks ago, on February 4th, 2016, that the 12 parties of the Trans-Pacific Partnership signed the agreement. So the bookend is on Monday, President Trump withdrew the United States from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And so that what happened? Well, a lot of things, but we can talk about that. My view is we started the year with something overall positive for the U.S. That's not a surprise to hear from this podium. But in fact, I've been at CSIS 4.5 years now. The first commentary I wrote when I came to CSIS was about TPP and how it benefited the U.S. economy. So that's not a surprise. But more importantly, TPP had placed the United States and U.S. norms at the center of Pacific economic affairs, which was very important for the future. It's also worth recalling that not only was TPP supported by the parties who negotiated it, but it was a very attractive agreement for many other Pacific Rim economies. In fact, there seemed to be a queue forming outside the door for accessions to TPP on a very short order. So it actually looked like we were onto something fairly useful and fairly durable. Unfortunately, the agreement never gained momentum at home for a lot of reasons, and the politics of the moment shifted very much away from sort of a rejection of policy elites, and certainly I think trade agreements as a whole, trade deals got wrapped up in sort of the elite's agenda that didn't benefit everyone. So what we see basically is, and throughout the year there were other shocks. I would note it was not just TPP, it was not just the United States. June 23rd, the referendum in Great Britain to leave the European Union was a major shock and surprised everyone along the way. So there's a thread here that is, I think, affecting trade policy worldwide. But I think today, if I to summarize our current situation, we've reached what Ian Bremmer memorably called the G0. He wrote a book in 2012 called Every Nation for Itself. And he mentioned this notion of a G0, where no single country or durable alliance is able to meet the challenges of global leadership. I think that's true in the trading system now. We're in for some work to bring the American people along to, if these agreements are beneficial, we've got to show how they are and make it clear. But more importantly, there's an issue of direction in the global economy and global coordination and alliances that is very much under challenge. So that's where we are.
Okay, thank you. That's a helpful start, and there'll be, I'm sure you're going to add more color to that in the clicker part of this discussion. But Scott Kennedy, so implicit in the question that frames this panel is the competition between the United States and China. Let's just cut to the chase here. That because the former President Obama characterized the trade or the TPP debate or the stakes in TPP as being about who writes the rules in Asia, certainly. So again, same kind of formulation. What's been going on over the past year? How did we get to where we are in U.S.-China economic and trade relations?
Thanks, Matt. Obviously, you can't talk about trade without talking about the 800-pound panda and the challenges that the U.S. has with China. But I think if you want to ask where we are, where is here in the relationship, it's a balance that you need to strike. On the positive side, two-way trade last year was about $600 billion between the U.S. and China, which supports, according to the U.S.-China Business Council, about 2.6 million jobs in the United States. The U.S. now has about $230 billion invested in China, and last year Chinese investment in the United States was about $120 billion and has continued to rise and is now far greater than the annual flows in the other direction. The U.S. American Chamber of Commerce survey that they just released showed that almost 70% of American companies in China are profitable, about almost 20% break even. So there are lots of challenges, but I think the first thing is that the glass is still 3/4 full on the economic relationship. On the other hand, I do think we've, over the last several years, and it became more apparent in 2016, been sliding toward greater trade tensions with China because the balance in benefits between the two sides has tipped more in the Chinese direction, away from Americans. And within the United States, the balance of benefits have shifted, and those in manufacturing, working class, have not as benefited as much as those on Wall Street. And why. You could say to some extent has to do with China's more aggressive role of the state under Xi Jinping. I think it also has to do to some extent with the Obama administration's slow recognition of the change in Chinese approach and their emphasis on a rules-based order and negotiation, which brought individual benefits, but mostly was small ball and lost sight of the big picture. And then Washington also, as Scott said, was not able to get TPP done, and somehow we stole defeat from the jaws of victory on that. And as a result, I think that also clouds the relationship bilaterally, even though China is not a party to TPP.
Okay, great. That's helpful. And again, we're going to elaborate more on that. So why don't we get you all involved? So if you could put up the first clicker question. Again, as Mike said, make sure your power is on your clicker, the power button at the top, and then you can try to answer this question. In 2017, the main focus of Trump administration trade policy will be A, stepped up enforcement actions, B, renegotiation of NAFTA, C, launch of new bilateral negotiations, D, renegotiation of TPP. That doesn't get a single vote. Wow.
We have an informed audience.
That's right. Okay. How are we doing? We're getting, give another sort of 10 seconds. I think we can start talking even if Will lets this run a little bit longer. Okay, so the right answer, or at least the audience answer, is B. Scott Miller, do you want to kind of talk about this and whether they're right?
Well, this is certainly, one of the things that you've seen this week is the strong intention of President Trump to fulfill campaign promises in very specific ways. And no doubt the renegotiation of NAFTA was a specific campaign promise. So I think it is right that that will be kicked off as a project. Both the governments of Mexico and Canada have basically agreed with that prospect. And it came up in Wilbur Ross's testimony in his nomination hearing for Secretary of Commerce. We haven't heard from Ambassador Lighthizer yet, and his testimony for his confirmation hearing has not been scheduled. But look, this is probably an important priority. NAFTA remains a vitally important agreement to the United States. It is Canada and Mexico are a quarter of our world trade, and importantly, North America forms a network of production systems and what we call value chains that makes North American products globally competitive. And so it's a vitally important agreement. It's 23 years old. It's probably got some improvements that can be made. What no one's defined yet is what exactly it means to renegotiate, what are the subjects of that, and what does improvement look like. And if I read the law correctly, it would begin with the administration notifying the Congress of its intent to enter into a negotiation, and at that point, Congress would be involved with hearings and setting those objectives. So it's a long process, but you're probably right, that's going to kick off.
A?
Let me comment briefly on A, because I do think that we're going to see a stronger enforcement agenda, specifically, and this came up in Mr. Ross's testimony as the Commerce Secretary nominee, about the self-initiation of trade remedy cases. That is a part of current law. It's within current law. It has not been done very often. Usually, someone who believes that they are suffering from unfair import competition the industry itself will bring the claim on its own and demonstrate injury and look for relief. But there is a provision under law for the U.S. government to self-initiate cases. That's likely to happen. I also think that in general there will be a scratchier tone to U.S. trade policy. If you look at just the reputation of Ambassador Lighthizer during his era in the Reagan administration, he was associated with the voluntary export restraints on autos for Japan. That was the time when we negotiated the U.S.-Japan semiconductor agreement. So these are sort of the old ways, and Mr. Lighthizer is a tough negotiator, has been in private practice, will be again if he's confirmed at USTR. So I think that stepped-up enforcement agenda, again, part of a campaign promise, likely to happen, will probably be done in the context of U.S. law, not outside law.
Great. That's, let me just say a quick word about C and D, and then maybe, I don't know if Scott Kennedy wants to add anything. But on C, so the bilateral, obviously this administration has expressed explicitly a preference for bilateral negotiations, and I would expect them to, to look at some options for bilateral deals. Bilateral deals have always been part of the toolkit, and they make sense in certain cases. I would say, for example, a bilateral, which is not in this region, but with the UK, once the UK resolves its relationship with Europe, probably makes a lot of sense. Within Asia, the countries that have been talked about for possible bilateral deals are Japan. TPP was really a bilateral FTA with Japan, with some other, flourishing around it, but that was the big part of TPP. Personally, I'm a little skeptical about the value of doing that, because I think it's going to be quite difficult, actually, to pull out the U.S.-Japan part of TPP and negotiate. We're going to end up spending a lot of time talking about the old issues on which there have been tensions for many years: automobiles, agriculture, and the U.S. and Japan, the power of the U.S.-Japan relationship is really not in that stuff. It's more in the new stuff, the stuff that TPP was trying to do in creating new rules of the road for things like labor and environment, intellectual property, state-owned enterprises, digital trade. The U.S. and Japan are pretty aligned on those issues, and I think there's not much to talk about really between us. We could get that done, but then we'll get caught up in all this ag and auto stuff again, and I think it would be a pretty complicated thing to do. There are other possibilities: Vietnam, ultimately maybe even China. That's been not kicked around by this administration, but it's been, others have talked about it. Our colleagues at the Peterson Institute have suggested that might be something that could be pursued eventually. Doesn't seem like that's going to be in the cards soon. And then just one thing, because two people did vote for renegotiation of TPP. I mean, I will say that that's obviously, when we put that up there, we did all this before Monday. So obviously things have changed, and that seems now unlikely in 2017 to happen. But what I would say about this is, TPP as TPP may be dead. I think one has to accept that. But the notion of high standard trade and investment negotiations in the Asia-Pacific that the United States is not only involved in, but is leading to create new rules of the road, that seems to me that's in United States interest. And at some point, we're going to have to get back in that business. So I do think that there is a reason to believe that maybe not in 2017, but beyond that, that we're going to be back in the game of trying to, we're not going to ever, we may not be called TPP, it may not have the exact same chapters that TPP has it, but I think it wouldn't be unreasonable to predict that we'll be back in this game eventually. By the way, the report that Mike mentioned, the Asian Economic Strategy Commission report that we issued on January 5th, co-chair, which Amy and Scott and I worked on with John Huntsman, Charlene Barshevsky, and Evan Greenberg, recommended that we figure out a way to get back to something like TPP. So stay tuned on that. Scott, did you want to say anything before we move to the China questions?
Just a short note. I mean, I would put myself in the A camp. I just want to make one, for all the reasons that you all mentioned, and for all the people that voted correctly. But also, but not mentioned explicitly, but implicitly is the role of the WTO. Yeah. It's possible that there could be more WTO cases, but I don't think that you've got a pile high number of cases in the inbox at the USTR ready to just launch. And my sense is that there's not a lot of confidence in the WTO on the negotiating side or in the enforcement side in the new administration. And so I think the U.S. is going to have a much more complex relationship with the WTO than it's had, and isn't going to rely on it. So I'd go short on malpractice lawyers, long on trade lawyers, short on hoteliers in Geneva for this year.
That's right. I would actually agree with Scott on the WTO issue. If you look at dispute settlement at the WTO, it's a useful forum, but it has a selection bias, is that countries bring cases they are almost certain to win. Okay, and I think the winning percentage of the complainant is something like 88% since the start of the dispute settlement. That says these aren't 50-50 decisions that you bring. And the real question for me is how many 80-20 issues are there at USTR? My guess is not many, but we'll see how that unfolds.
Okay, great. Let's move on to the second question. Again, make sure your power's on and select one of these. In 2017, U.S.-China economic relations will A, slide into mutual recrimination and tit-for-tat retaliation, B, improve as the two sides strike deals, and C, stay about the same. Okay, well, that was easy, right? All right, Scott Kennedy.
All right, love those optimists. They're holding out for B. You know, I would agree with the majority. You know, and I think you know, I think we need to recognize it takes two to dance. It takes two countries to have a trade war. In my house, you don't need two people to dance. You can just wander around if you see us with the music. But in most places, it takes two to dance, and I think for a trade war. So why do I think the U.S. and China are both going to engage in this conflict? And I think it's because of actually the similarities, the surprising similarities, but, and almost the twin similarities of the leadership in Beijing and Washington. And I'm not just speaking about their common commitment to coiffed hair and that both are fantastically rich. There's three other things. The first is both are committed to fair trade. Xi Jinping's speech in Davos was brilliant, but look at what China does, not what Xi Jinping says. China still has huge market access barriers for imports and investment. And similarly, the Trump administration believes all is fair in love and trade. And they don't believe they're starting a trade war, they just believe they're engaging in one that China has started a long time ago. So the first is a sort of similar view of trade, the role of the state. The second is their negotiating styles are actually surprisingly similar. Are two administrations and people that are comfortable with unpredictability, comfortable with risk, comfortable with pressure, comfortable with dragging things out until the other side says Trump or says Xi or yes. And so I think that style leads them both to want to put pressure on the other. I think thirdly, the commonality is that neither side wants to give in. Right? For Trump, from their perspective, China has a faltering economy with growing debt that's dependent more on the U.S. than the U.S. depends on China. You have the 19th Party Congress coming up later this year, and as a result, the U.S. side views that Xi Jinping is in a position where he must deal because he wants political stability. He doesn't want anything to go wrong in the relationship, and therefore the U.S. side believes they have the strategic advantage. Absolutely same calculus mirrored from the Chinese position. They believe China's economy is more resilient, Americans are soft, and its lobbyists are powerful, and Trump is just angling for a deal. And China does not want to back down, particularly because of the 19th Party Congress, because it would be a very bad time for someone who wants to continue their leadership to show weakness. So both sides have the mirror opposite views and think that they are in the position to make the other side give in first. So I think both sides are coming to this dance, got their shoes polished, and they're ready to go at it.
Is there a prospect, though, some things, you know, we could strike some deals, or whether favorable to us or not? I mean, is that something that, you know, could happen in certain areas?
I think it's conceivable. Certainly the Chinese would like a deal yesterday. And have been clamoring for one, and that they want to see through all of the fog of to use the general's expression, of what's going on. And they would like to be able to go back to the BIT negotiations, go back to the SNED or something like that, to find some floor in the relationship and move forward. I just don't, and there may be some limited things that a Trump administration would want, and I don't think they're going to just take a sharp left without thinking things through carefully. But I don't think we're going to see agreements on the big stuff this year. I think the broader strategy is going to be pressure to try and, at a minimum, get the relationship back on track in a direction that they would want, where they think it's gone off track, or if they have an even more fundamental view about China, that it's a strategic threat to the United States. We haven't clarified what that view is within the Trump administration, but either one points towards conflict in 2017.
Okay, Scott.
Yeah, look, there are a lot of problems with the U.S.-China relationship. I've maintained for a long time it's much worse than its press clippings, and would encourage you to talk to any executive of an American firm operating in China, if you want to confirm that or challenge that. But the question for me, and this is what I'm really watching the Trump administration for, is the problem selection. Which problems are actually going to work on? Okay, which problems do this administration think are important enough to raise to the level of this sort of real pushback? If the answer is currency, well, look, that's a little out of date. All right. If the answer is excess capacity in steel and aluminum, well, that's a problem, and it's a problem for industries in the United States. But it's not the problem of the next 10 or 15 years that, for instance, intellectual property theft and subsidies are. So for me, it's not that there won't be frictions. I definitely think there will be. The question is, what will the frictions be concerning themselves with? And that's, I think, where the whole thing rises or falls.
What I worry about is the investment relationship, because on the one hand, U.S. investors in China, as this Scott just indicated, are more concerned than they actually are saying publicly, although the AmCham, I think the American Chamber in China, just did its annual survey of members again and showed again that something like 75–80% of the companies responded that they feel less welcome in China than they did the year before. So things are getting more uncomfortable for a lot of reasons, some slower growth, some higher labor costs and sort of natural factors, as it were, but a lot of it is because the policy environment has become a lot more restricted. So and the business sector has been the bulwark of support for the relationship. So whereas when we did Japan stuff back in the 80s, you had problems on the economic side, but it was balanced by the alliance. And you don't have that. You have the reverse in China. You don't have the strategic trust, but you do have the business support for the relationship. If that goes away, I think that could really cause greater problems. So that's a concern. And then you've got the flood of Chinese investment coming into the United States, which is going to, may have slowed a bit because of capital controls, because of, concerns about our pushback, but it's coming. And the numbers are already increasing on a flow basis, and that's going to raise some concerns. And again, as a Japan guy, we all remember Pebble Beach and Rockefeller Center and stuff, and let's sell those again to China. I'd be happy to sell those again at an overvalued price. But seriously, there's some other things that I'm not so sure how people are going to feel when China starts buying out Silicon Valley or or other directly sensitive areas. So I think we've got this would have happened anyway, Trump or no Trump. But I think this is an area of concern to me. So let's move on to the next question, because I do want to give the audience a few minutes. I'm allowed to do that, right, in the panel at the end. Third question. In 2017, China's efforts to exert economic leadership in Asia will, A, lead to conclusion of RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, B, see China launch another Bretton Woods-like institution like the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, C, see China double down on its Belt and Road Infrastructure Initiative, D, make little headway. Okay, that's an interesting. Give it another second.
Only 50 votes in so far, so
yeah.
Keep clicking.
Yeah, some of you are shy. There are more than 50 people in here, so we encourage you. It's all anonymous, right? Nobody's looking at your vote. All right. Okay, Scott.
Wow. Here's where I'm going to. Well, I see the logic. I don't see the money. And China has pledged a lot, created AIIB, the new development bank, and they both started to make loans. And China has announced 40 to 50 billion in deals through the Belt and Road. And certainly part of Xi Jinping's statement in Davos is that they're going to continue to expand. But I think if you look at China's economic situation, its financial situation, they are quite concerned, and their wallet is not as fat as they thought. The concerns with the outflow of foreign exchange ramped up. China lost $1 trillion in foreign exchange last year, from 4 down to 3. And with the U.S. Interest rate hike, with challenges in China's economy, potential for continued depreciation, they are exerting extreme capital controls right now, and I think that's going to continue for the year. Again, we mentioned the 19th Party Congress as part of that. And so there's not going to be as much money. So I think you'll see more advertising on the Belt and Road this year than actual spending. I do think you'll see the Chinese engage in a variety, efforts to negotiate a variety of agreements, including RCEP and bilaterals. But I think these are going to be new deals with old rules. Sort of new agreements, but sort of the same playbook we've had before. Standard, run-of-the-mill, vanilla tariff-reducing agreements, relatively narrowly construed, nothing dramatic. So it will look like, in some ways, China is moving forward and writing the rules, but they're going to use the old playbook. And it's just because, the pile will look higher of deals, but it's nothing fundamental. I think, to some extent, you might see the U.S. be more active. If they go with bilateral deals, I think these might include a lot of the kinds of things that were going to be in TPP, which will be innovative and important, but they will look traditional because they will be bilateral. But that, I think, will be deceiving.
Yeah, just first, the audience is quite skeptical about RCEP being completed. I think it's important to mention that. I agree with your skepticism, but it's not China's fault. It is India's fault. Okay, or that India is the country you handicap at sort of how much longer, how many more years it will take for them to come to an agreement. So I think that conclusion is correct. But the issue of economic leadership is a difficult one. And as an example, another thing that happened in the past year is China hosted the G20. All right. Special prize for anybody in the audience who can name 2 concrete deliverables from the China G20 meeting. Yeah.
I follow the G20, and I'm struggling. But no, I know one of them was an infrastructure-related initiative, the Global Infrastructure Connectivity Alliance, which they put out there to reinforce. They got the G20 to agree to a sort of a new organization that's going to be managed by the World Bank to push out their sort of support their vision that you all are interested in, which, by the way, warms the cockles of my heart that so many people are interested in Belt and Road. Because that is, as Mike said, a topic that we're looking at in the Simon Chair, and actually all of us are participating in this through this Reconnecting Asia. .csis.org microsite, and we encourage you to look at that. We're looking at all these infrastructure developments, and we need another session to talk about that. But I think this is I think enough's been said on this, unless you want to ask about it afterwards. Just one more question, which is not directly on trade, but as econ folks, we want to ask a sort of general question about economic conditions in the region. Which major economy in Asia is most likely to surprise on the upside? In other words, have stronger growth than expected? A, China, B, Japan, C, Korea, D, India, E, none of the above. We usually avoid none of the above because we don't want to push you into that easy, cop-out answer, but in this case it's significant, so potentially. I don't mean to steer you towards that. Okay, I think we have sort of enough answers coming in to answer. There's a sort of mixed view on this. I mean, I think embedded in this question is the reality that nobody's doing very well. I mean, the expectations are not so great for any country, with the possible exception of India, which has been doing pretty well, growing over 7%, and that's the forecast of the IMF for this year. The question there, and we need Rick Rosso here to really kind of parse this and look in more detail, is to whether Modi can continue to move forward with some of his key reforms, including this new goods and sales tax, which he is trying to push through. I think that is going to go through this year, which may create a more efficient tax system, which may promote more growth. But, India's external story is still pretty, as Scott Miller just alluded to, problematic. And so, we'll see with India. Korea and Japan continue to struggle with structural problems, demographic challenges, and the need for structural reform. In the case of Korea, you have this additional problem of political uncertainty, which, because of President Park's problems and likelihood that she's going to be leaving office in the middle of this year. I don't want to steal Victor's thunder, but and so I think that's put a further damper on investment sentiment in the region. You got huge debt problems in both Korea and Japan that's putting a cloud over. But both of those countries, I'm going to let Scott Kennedy talk about China, but both Japan and Korea are benefiting from the sort of early Trump exuberance about growth in the United States. If Trump is going to cut taxes, invest in infrastructure, that is pushing up our market. It's also pushing up the dollar, and that means that the yen and the yuan are depreciating, and that's giving a boost to exports from both those countries, which and the markets are also rising there. So, that's the question there on trade, is whether those countries are going to benefit from that, weaker currency position and strengthen exports, or whether a possible slide into protectionism is going to cut that all off. And so I think that's those are the big risk factors on both sides with those economies. Scott, you want to talk about China a minute?
Sure. I think China last year clocked in at 6.7%, a little bit higher than most expected. But since Xi Jinping said, let's get 6.5 to 7%, they got 6.5 to 7% growth. And I think they'll do that this year. The question is, how much will they have to step on the gas to get that number? Last year, state-owned enterprises increased their investment by 20%. Private companies increased their investment by 3%. In China. Big difference. So the real economy, the people that are most efficient, are quite concerned about China. China expanded credit about 20%, and the budget deficit was about 3.8% of GDP. And they actually, even though there's a lot of corporate debt in China, government sovereign debt is relatively low. So they have plenty of room if they want to step on, for stimulus to hit that number. So I think it comes back to what we've been talking about, is the external environment. To what extent does that turn significantly negative to affect China's export performance and investment in China, depreciation, and the extent to which those trade clouds form, you'll see the central bank and others step more on the gas with stimulus. But I think, so it's not the number they're going to hit, it's going to be the way they get there.
Say a quick.
Yeah, just one thing on the wisdom of crowds. I note that the main answer here is not China. But also, I would point out, just if you read the fine print of the IMF's October World Economic Outlook, India is projected to grow faster than China. I don't know when the last time that happened was, but it was a while ago. So.
Some of the none of the above people may be friends of Southeast Asia, for example, who predict that the Philippines is doing surprisingly well, Vietnam in the 6+% range. So you could have some surprises from those significant economies. So I think maybe some of you were thinking that way. Okay, I've been told we can buy a few minutes of the break here to allow some audience questioning here, including maybe of your own answers. Maybe you want to ask why we answered the way we did. So if you have a question, there's a gentleman in the back. There's a microphone. If you could just identify yourself and ask a quick question.
Yes, Britt Mitchell, Renaissance Institute, Baltimore. Last year we had a conference here at CSIS on a forecast for Asia. I think it was like in May, perhaps. And there was quite a lot of attention paid to the alternate to TPP, which was a China-led Trade Organization, and that is almost never mentioned anymore. I forget the initials, I'm sorry.
Yes, that's RCEP.
That's RCEP. I thought it might be.
The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. It is basically an ASEAN plus 6 arrangement. It's the 10 ASEAN countries plus the 6 economies with which they already have free trade agreements. India, China, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea. And so it was mentioned in a previous slide, just we didn't spell out the acronym, so apologies for that. But it still continues along its pace, and at least we believe it's unlikely to conclude. Thanks.
Okay, other questions? Let me just say, while you're thinking of questions, that was a May conference. That was our JETRO conference that Mike mentioned that we, the Japan chair and the Simon chair, do every spring. And we will do that again this year, and we'll look further in those questions about these competing architectures, though one horse has just left the race, so it's a little simpler maybe. Yes, ma'am. There's a woman right here in the front. Thank you.
Hi, Chia Ching from United Daily News. As mentioned, that President Trump may sign bilateral agreements with other countries. I'm just wondering, what if, is there a chance for Taiwan to be first round? Why and why not? Thank you.
Somebody want to take that on? You want to, Scott, start?
I think it's has to be taken seriously as a real possibility. There's with a movement away from multilateral negotiations, multilateral agreements, and move towards bilaterals. And there are advisors in the Trump administration who have a soft spot for Taiwan, who believe it's been treated unfairly, and believe the economic relationship could be strengthened. So for economic reasons, maybe strategic reasons, would pursue that. The question is, how deep would it be? What would a Tsai administration be willing to give? There's been lots of challenges in trying to address some important problems in the bilateral trade relationship. But I would say there's good economic and political reasons why we might expect a Trump administration to pursue that. I don't think that would be as a big bang for its buck in terms for overall the overall American economy. It could be beneficial for Taiwan as it's been trying to diversify its economic relationships to be less dependent on China, and spending more time trying to expand relations with Southeast Asia and also with the United States. So there's reasons why they would want to negotiate. Whether they can conclude it or not, I think is still up in the air.
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. I should have mentioned Taiwan when I was talking about bilateral deals, and that is a good point. I agree with Scott. I think there's more prospect on the political side of some sort of deal with Taiwan. I think the economics is still challenging. I mean, that's been the question as to whether Taiwan's willing to put some sensitive issues on the table, particularly in the agriculture sector. Longstanding set of issues there, but if Madam Tsai, who was a WTO negotiator for Taiwan and knows these issues, is willing to take some heat and maybe move forward on some of those issues, I think there's a possibility, and the political prospects are I think better under a Trump administration. Okay, one more question, and then there's a gentleman there.
Hi, my name is Song. I'm a journalist from Shanghai. My question is, Mr. Trump has been emphasizing the strong U.S. dollar is killing U.S. economy. But people say his policy is going to be only strengthening the U.S. dollar. So what's going to be the picture of this U.S. dollar issue by the end of this year? And Asian economies, including China, Japan, and Korea, be benefiting from this? Thank you very much.
Well, there is a kind of a tension in Trumponomics with respect to the currency, because his desire for other countries to raise the value of their currencies and his desire for trade deficits to be reduced suggests that he is kind of a weak dollar-oriented guy, and he's actually said now that he thinks the dollar's too strong, which is, by the way, very unusual for a president to say ever, but certainly this early on and even before he has a Treasury Secretary in place. But on the other hand, his stimulative policies of tax cuts and infrastructure spending and so forth suggest that we're going to have more growth and more higher interest rates and a stronger dollar. And there is a tension there, and I do worry that in that situation, particularly if he does move forward with his domestic economic program, that he's going to step up his criticism of particularly East Asian economies, where there is a history, if not a current reality, of let's just call it what it is, manipulation. I mean, it's a sensitive word, but there's clearly been persistent intervention in the markets in not just China, but Japan, Korea, Singapore, Taiwan. Over time. Right now, none of those countries would pass the test, and they don't in the Treasury evaluation, but there is this story, and so I think Trump is building and feeding on that. It's relatively easy to call people a name, and under the law, the Treasury has this semi-annual process of doing that, of making that determination. Hasn't called anyone that since 1994, but could very well change that position under Trump. And in fact, of the things that I would expect in 2017, I think he's going to start calling people currency manipulators. It doesn't mean very much in practice. In legal terms, it launches a year of discussions and negotiations, but at the end of that, sort of a vague set of things that could be done, which could include something retaliatory, but that would then probably violate WTO, so it's not clear where this would all lead. One final point on currency. Senator Schumer, the other day when he was interviewed, the minority leader in the Senate, said this is something that Trump should move forward. He's long been an advocate for tougher currency provisions in trade agreements and in U.S. law. And so I think this currency story is going to be a powerful one. And I think East Asian economies need to know that this is a real risk to them, that both sides of that story. I did recognize right up here, Sherry, and then we'll take a break.
Thank you. Katie Wang with Newtown Dynasty TV. My question is, by withdrawing from TPP, do you think the United States can still exercise its influence economically in the region in Asia Pacific? Or how will that give China more opportunity or not?
It's a huge blow. I mean, it takes away an important, there are a couple problems. One is credibility, because we put so much for the last 5 years, spanning, a lot of time, effort, capital. We invested in this initiative, and we've walked away from it, so it sort of generally blows our credibility. But now we also don't have an organizing principle for our economic engagement in the region, at least from a policy and strategy perspective. And it's going to be hard to reinvent that. There are things, and we're all coming up with ideas of using APEC to advance some of the rules-related issues that we care about. But again, without that credibility, I'm not sure how many people are going to listen and follow. Scott Kennedy addressed everybody addressed a little bit the question of China's leadership and the opportunity there for China. But, I think it's going to be challenging for China for a number of reasons to, replace or supplant the U.S. in that role. But that doesn't give me that much comfort either. The U.S. needs to have a game here, and right now we don't have one.
Yeah, I would just note that the United States still remains the largest importer in the world. And so as long as the U.S. consumer economy continues to pull products from the export-oriented markets in the Asia-Pacific, it will be an important customer. And that will keep some economic interest in at least the norms of the United States. I would also note that Asian security will be a piece of the calculation in terms of U.S. reputation and U.S. influence. The U.S. security under Secretary Mattis and President Trump may or may not change versus what we've seen. So we'll see what becomes of the Asia pivot. But there are other elements. TPP is a setback. Not having TPP is a setback. There are other offsets.
Yeah, I just say, I think the bottom line principle that we're probably going to see from a Trump administration on trade is pursuit of reciprocity. It's very different from a free trade approach, which is the lower the barriers, the better, and that all sides win because you generate more wealth. What the vehicle is to implement that, whether it's going to be trade remedies, bilateral agreements and things, I think it's going to be a mixed bag. It's not going to be creating a new architecture that has a name with an organization with a list of rules. But I do think that even though TPP may have died, the issues that TPP addressed with regard to e-commerce, investment, state-owned enterprises, those are issues which the world needs to tackle, whether it comes through a regional agreement or back to the WTO or bilaterals. We need those rules. Those are important for the global economy and for U.S. interests. So I think eventually, one way or another, we're going to come back to those issues.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm sorry we ran over, but I think this is an issue that is sort of unusually interesting to this group this year. It isn't always the case, and so we're delighted that you all sat through all that, and I hope you got something out of that. I did. I always learn something from these guys. So please join me in thanking the panel. And our break time has been sliced to about 2.5 minutes, but maybe 7.5, 10:40. Okay, as much as that. All right, you've got 12 minutes then. Thanks.
on to our second and third panel, which I will chair. This next panel, and we always try to do one on leadership in Asia, the relations between leaders, the narratives and discourse of leaders domestically. These are really important variables in any region, but they're especially important in Asia right now. I teach a course on leaders in Asia, past and present, at Georgetown, and I always say you need to study leaders because agency matters, their structure, but agency really matters. More recently, I've been saying structure really matters, but leaders do matter, and we have some changes, some potential changes, and the relationships among leaders and with our new president will be important in how 2017 unfolds in the diplomacy of the Asia Pacific. We'll do defense and especially maritime in the panel after this. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip the introductions, although we have the region pretty well covered, and actually go to the first clicker question for us to get started. And we will. So the question is, which of the following leaders will be replaced in 2017? Now, none of the above, if you think there are other ones who are not on this list, don't click none of the above. None of the above just means not these four leaders. We'll talk about other leadership changes across the region as well. Is that the Australian embassy voting, or? Okay, interesting. This is not a vote, by the way. It's a prediction. And nor is it a vote of confidence. This is an objective, analytical process with a highly refined methodology. This is to tease out some ideas and get the panel started. Let's go down the line on this one. Talk about the leadership standing of the individuals up there, others we should be thinking about. And I think I'll start actually on Abe, who people thought by far least likely to be replaced this year. I think that's a very good reading of Japan's domestic politics. Prime Minister Abe has, in recent polls, over 65% support, which is remarkable for a Japanese prime minister this far into their term. It also makes him politically the most popular at home and the leader with the most stable political system within the G7 and arguably within the G20, which, if you live through 6 prime ministers in 6 years, is remarkable and probably not something most people would have predicted. In my course on Japanese politics at Georgetown a few years ago, I took to telling my Japanese students, you should pay very close attention because given the current rate of Japan's demographic decline and the turnover of prime ministers, you will all be prime minister someday. Well, not anymore. I mean, this is a very, very politically powerful prime minister. And importantly, longevity is critical to getting things done in the economy, in diplomacy, or in security policy. And I think one reason that Prime Minister Abe has high support is because after such a high turnover of prime ministers, now rivaled by Australia, you can't get anything done. So even though the economic performance is more anemic than people want, they are seeing, I think the public's seeing enough that they're not ready to just change horses again and try something new. That said, the Westminster system, or the parliamentary system, as some on this panel know well, can be very unforgiving and unpredictable. The Japanese saying, isun sake wa yami, one step ahead is darkness, is precisely because of that. So there could be some black swan scandals or something, but I think you guys all got it right. And even if we did this for global leaders, I hope I'm not jinxing him, but Abe Shinzo would be clearly one you'd expect to be in power this entire year and probably beyond. Let's go down the line and let you each comment on whichever leader you like and ones we may not have thought of, starting with Andrew.
Once upon a time, Australia used to enjoy long periods of political stability. So if you look at the period from 1983 to 2007, we had two leaders, Bob Hawke and then John Howard, and we also, I think no coincidence, had a period of extraordinary prosperity. Well, what happened? Since that time, of course, Australia has been affected by many of the global trends that we've seen play out here in this country most recently, perhaps most dramatically, but also in Europe and elsewhere in the Asia Pacific. We've seen growing polarisation and fragmentation in our politics, the rise of small parties, independents, that sort of thing. We've seen the decline of the traditional media and this sort of social media phenomenon, which again is fragmenting the media space and creating, if not alternative facts, then certainly alternative realities, I guess, in our polity. And along with all of this, we've got the rise of a more dissatisfied, cantankerous, or as we'd say, cranky electorate whose expectations are increasingly difficult to meet. An increased sort of populist strain in Australian politics, as we're seeing elsewhere, and also an increased velocity in politics with this churn of political leaders. And most recently, we saw Mike Baird, who only a year or two ago was a stunningly successful and popular Premier of New South Wales, fall from grace in terms of polling and public support and retire abruptly from politics. So this leadership churn goes on, and basically all of it points to a country that's getting harder to govern, and we're not on our own there. We, of course, had a lot of this play out in the 2016 election. The Turnbull government managed to hang on just by one seat. There's a band of independents and small parties that hold the balance of power in our Senate. To get anything through the Senate, the government effectively needs 9 of those 11 independent sort of crossbench votes. That's an incredibly difficult thing, and no surprise, again, it's getting harder for the government to get its agenda through. And when it does get legislation through, as it did fairly recently, to clamp down on trade union abuses in the construction industry, which are a lag on our economy, that legislation was radically watered down in the process. So even that win, even a win, what should have been a big win for the Turnbull government, turns out being something of a, perhaps not a Pyrrhic victory, but a bit of a damp squib. So where does this leave the Turnbull government? It leaves the Turnbull government seriously weakened, and it leaves it very constrained in terms of what it can get done. The government finds itself increasingly jammed on its left. You had Bill Shorten running an aggressively populist campaign, tackling the government on things like a scare campaign about healthcare, which is a very sensitive, significant issue in Australia. Very effective campaign by Labor. Many people would say, I think, quite a dishonest scare campaign, but nonetheless one that worked. And then on the other side, Turnbull's got the rise of right-wing populist forces. Some of you would have heard of Pauline Hanson, who came to prominence in the late 1990s, faded from the scene abruptly, found herself at the wrong end of the law, but is back with 4 senators, an extraordinary phenomenon. So on the right, the Conservative coalition is being sort of nibbled away at by Hanson, One Nation, and also some of the more conservative voices inside the Liberal Party, in particular a guy in the Senate called Cory Bernardi, who is increasingly influential and giving Turnbull more problems on that flank. When Turnbull took the Prime Ministership from Tony Abbott, he rested his case on two key things. The first one was the lack of a clear economic narrative, and the second one was Abbott's poor polling. Well, against either of those measures, it has to be said that the Turnbull government's not travelling terribly well. In terms of the primary vote, it's down 35 to about 39. In terms of two-party preferred voting, it's down about 48-52, I think, although those figures were from before the end of the year, and Australia's just now coming out of its long summer slumber, so who knows. But the point is, the government's not travelling that well. When I was back there was no sense of real direction or excitement inside the government or outside the government, I think it's fair to say. So what's going to happen this year? I don't see a leadership challenge. I think the Australian public are sick of instability. I think there is a hankering for a more for some more continuity. There's a lack of enthusiasm for the government. There's a lack of enthusiasm, though, also for the Labor opposition. In fact, Shorten, the opposition leader, and Malcolm Turnbull in recent polls are the most unpopular pairing of political leaders in the last 20 years. So there's a widespread lack of enthusiasm, but I think that doesn't translate into a leadership change. One of the most compelling reasons for that is that the Liberal Party is still traumatised by what it did a couple of years ago. We've seen it on the Labor side of politics as well. I think it's now widely accepted that it doesn't work. But the other factor is that there's simply not a credible alternative figure as leader in the coalition party. So, having been proven comprehensively wrong about American politics, like most people, for the last year, I'm loath to make forecasts. But if I had to guess, I'd say that answer A is incorrect, and that Malcolm Turnbull will be around at the end of the year. But who knows?
You know, he has Turnbull and Abe have that in common. There's no credible alternative in Japan either, really, at least not yet in the opposition, and few in the ruling party. But Australia does stand out, and we can come back to this in all the comments. It does stand out, I think, within the region in being the most susceptible, in a way, for understandable historic reasons, but the most susceptible to the kind of anti-immigration, anti-globalization wave that we've seen in North America and Europe. And perhaps you don't see in the rest of the region, but let's see what others say, and we can come back to that.
As the leader of the Southeast Asia program here at CSIS, I see my role largely as giving voice to Southeast Asia, the strategic importance of Southeast Asia in policy dialogues or policy thinking. But right now, as you can tell, I don't have much of a voice, so I'm not sure I'm going to do my job very well today, and I might keep my comments a little bit short. But I have two leaders on this list from Southeast Asia that I should comment on. It's quite interesting to see that the audience chose the most likely to be replaced as Najib, Prime Minister of Malaysia. I can certainly understand the logic behind that choice. First of all, there's growing speculation that there may well be elections called in 2017. They don't have to be called until mid-2018, but there's a lot of speculation, and Najib has even indicated that he's going to call elections soon. So there will be an election, it looks like. And of course, Najib has been really wrapped up with this 1MDB scandal that's been quite significant internationally and domestically, and has led to a lot of public criticism. And the economy is struggling, so a lot of ingredients there. But at the same time, it does seem that Najib has dealt very effectively with the scandal at home. He has been very adroit at consolidating his position within the UMNO party. And so he's kind of moved his domestic political opponents. He's kept them sort of divided and in disarray. Anwar is still in prison, of course, and although former Prime Minister Mahathir and Najib's former Deputy Prime Minister Muhyiddin have launched an opposition party that may gain traction over time, I think given the Malaysian political system that is pretty effectively gerrymandered to ensure that the rural districts have a lot more voting weight, and he still has pretty strong control over those. And so I think I think the reason why he's thinking of calling an election is that he thinks he's in a pretty strong position right now, which may not last well into 2018. So I actually think he's in a pretty good position to stay in power. But we will see if the audience is right on that prediction. The other leader here is Prayut, Prime Minister Prayut from Thailand. I think, as the audience does, that it's extremely unlikely that he will be replaced. First of all, although he has been strongly committed to holding elections in 2017, I think now it looks more likely that the elections will be pushed back. Of course, he originally promised elections in 2015 after the 2014 coup, so this has been a sliding scale. We're now if elections don't happen until 2018, it will be 4 years after the coup. But it's taken quite a while for them to come up with a draft constitution that then they finally put up for a referendum vote last year, and it passed, and that set the stage for potential elections in 2017. However, the new king has now asked for some revisions in the draft constitution, largely related to the regent provisions that would enable him to travel abroad, spend time abroad more frequently. He goes to Germany a lot. The speculation is that's about medical treatments, but clearly he intends to continue to spend a lot of time outside of Thailand, and he's looking for some revisions there. That throws a wrench into the timetable, because that will take a little while for that to be sorted out through the legislature. And this is already a very crowded schedule of a year with two major events that will probably take place towards the end of the year. One is the cremation of the king, the former king, and then the coronation of the new king. And so that's likely to take up a lot of the calendar from October through the end of the year. So it's very hard for me to see how elections would fit into that calendar. So I think elections are likely to slide to the right, to 2018, and even more so, Prayut has signaled that he is quite likely to run again, and I would expect him actually to run again and quite possibly win. So I think he looks like he's going to stick around for a little while. So in general, in Southeast Asia, I think the lineup looks likely to remain unchanged of the 10 ASEAN leaders. And if there were to be some sort of U.S.-ASEAN summit later this year, which I certainly hope there would be, I think the only change in the lineup in the photo would be President Trump.
So I'm gonna speak for Victor and Scott and predict that in 2017, Park Geun-hye will be removed from power, and Xi Jinping will not. And if you agree with that, we'll move on to the next question and let you elaborate, because we'll have questions on the 19th Party Congress and the Korean election. So the next clicker question is really about the dynamics between these leaders in the region and our new president. Who will have the best relationship with Donald Trump? And we didn't put none of the above. This is the best relationship in relative terms, and we can add others as we go along the whole panel on this one. I mean, Andrew's been in the room in a lot of summits, and I have too, and historically, you would expect that the American president and the Australian prime minister would, for reasons of history and, battle-forged relationships, have the best relationship. So that one's a bit surprising, but maybe you can give us some context on that one to begin, Andrew.
Yeah, look, I wouldn't rule out a strong personal relationship between President Trump and Prime Minister Turnbull. Doesn't seem immediately obvious that would be the case. But here's why I think that. Malcolm Turnbull, before his political career, had a very successful business career. He was a risk-taking, entrepreneurial guy. He was involved in the dot-com boom. He was a senior businessman at Goldman Sachs. So he's a deal maker. Malcolm Turnbull came to prominence well before politics as a deal maker, and I think that is a bond that he might be able to forge, in particular if he stills his inner greenie and soft pedal some of his more progressive views, because they may not receive quite the same welcome that they did until recently.
So that's one of the keys to answering this question is how much will these leaders choose to soft pedal their differences with President Trump, or how much can they politically? I mean, Abe has a lot of room to do that because he has no challengers and he has high popularity. So he has room probably that others don't. But domestically, do you think this is going to be a tough balancing act for Prime Minister Turnbull? You've seen the Lowy polls, 90% support the alliance, but 50% said before the election separate from the U.S. or distance from the U.S. if the outcome came out the way it did. What to make of that domestic political dimension?
I think we need to keep it in context. You know, there's a bit of a pattern here. When I was at school and just going into college, President Reagan was the president, and the mainstream Australian media view, certainly the view in the intelligentsia and the commentariat, was that President Reagan was a sort of B-grade movie actor, you know, senile, mad. He was going to lead us to a nuclear apocalypse. Obviously, today, Ronald Reagan is rightly seen as one of the greatest American presidents. So there's a need for perspective. During President Bush's more recent presidency, there was also, you know, a lot of negativity, a lot of static, and there are voices in Australia now saying, you know, this is intolerable, we should back away from the United States. Now's the time to sort of separate ourselves, move closer to China, perhaps certainly have a more independent foreign policy. You do hear that line, but it's not mainstream opinion. And I think the really important thing to focus on in Australia is that there's very strong bipartisan support for the alliance. The Turnbull government's view has been to engage closely with the new administration, and that's what I think Australia should do, and I think it is what Australia will do.
Scott, you had really interesting comments on the previous panel about Xi Jinping and Donald Trump's common hairstyles and negotiating style, but this would be a chance to elaborate, and particularly the domestic politics in both countries. For example, there's talk of an early trip to see Abe in Japan. I don't know if it'll happen. You know, should Donald Trump go to China and see Xi Jinping early? If you were recommending both leaders, would you say give it time or get in the room together soon? And how do the domestic politics in both countries affect that?
Sure. I do think getting together soon is something that the Chinese definitely would like. The sooner the better, whether it's in China or in the United States. And my sense is, even if we'd encourage Trump to do it, he probably would not go to China right away. Just to expand first on some of the similarities besides the hair and the bank account, they're both charismatic leaders, right? They both believe in personal loyalty. Both have lots of street smarts, right? You wouldn't call either bookish, right? Although Xi Jinping loves to quote authors, famous authors, Hemingway and others in many of his speeches, and give you the sense that he did read all of those things. But they also have some personal differences as well. Donald Trump is relatively ostentatious, likes gold-plated this and that. Xi Jinping's much simpler. If you walked through a park in Beijing and saw people that is really hot and they were just in T-shirts and stuff, that could be Xi Jinping, right? Xi Jinping drinks and can drink a lot. Donald Trump doesn't drink at all. Xi Jinping likes to watch soccer. Donald Trump likes to play golf. So if you're looking for like a grand bargain between these two over many of these differences, I would go, if you thought of Reagan and Gorbachev in Iceland and Reykjavik walking in the cold woods and came back and said, well, maybe we don't need all of these nuclear weapons. I don't think you're going to find that, whether it's along them going to the Great Wall or finding some, or in Florida at Trump's home. I still think the differences between them, the challenges, even though they've got some of these personality similarities, the domestic politics and the big differences that they have with each other probably make a big deal, and them getting along with each other personally, unlikely.
Let me real quickly follow up. When I was in the administration, the Bush administration, President Bush gave a speech in Japan before going to China, praising the importance of democracy and even Taiwan. And Hu Jintao, when asked about it, said, well, China's in its own way working on democracy. And Zellick gave the responsible stakeholder speech that's very famous in July 2005. But he essentially was saying China's not a responsible stakeholder. And rather than challenge him, Hu Jintao said, well, he gave a speech a month later and said, we're a responsible stakeholder, which was one of those dull moments. So he went out of his way to try to accommodate the American narrative. Xi has hammered again and again on this new model of great power relations. Do you think he's going to try to, the way Abe and Turnbull and others have, and May, do you think he's going to try to accommodate Donald Trump's narrative the way some of these other leaders have, or do you think he's going to actually challenge it because it is perhaps something that China doesn't accept, or because China is going to keep trying to impose its narrative, new model of great power relations and so forth?
Sure. I think it's going to turn heavily on the Chinese assessment of what the overall U.S. motive is in dealing with China. Do they believe that the U.S. just wants to make modest adjustments or maybe significant adjustments in the economic relationship to redivide the pie? Or do they perceive the U.S. as, unlike the 7 previous presidents and others, viewing the rise of China and the growth of Chinese power in and of itself a threat to the United States, and therefore really worried about the need to contain China, and so that's going to be judged on how the U.S. interacts on issues in the South China Sea, Taiwan, how far they push the relationship on non-economic grounds. So I think if they think these are issues that can be contained, of a floor created, then I think you could see them continue to exert, to basically engage in strategic patience with Trump and try to accommodate him. If not, then I think they're going to push back really hard. We saw the Chinese spokesman give an interview to NBC just yesterday, very strong remarks, and so that may be a sign of things to come. And so I think it depends heavily on how they read what Trump's overall goals are.
We're going to have a question, Victor, and ask you to predict the Korean election. But you've been in the summit meetings too. What's your take? Does the audience have it right?
I think so. I think you look at the list up there, the one that stands out. I mean, to me, the leader that stands out is the one who people predicted to have the best relationship, that's Shinzo Abe. And I think that's largely because Prime Minister Abe has already mapped out, at least in his own mind, a clear strategy of how he's going to engage and deal with the United States, under Donald Trump. I don't know, Mike, your views on this, but it seems to me from what I've seen, he wants to and has established a personal relationship, which is very important for leaders to engage at a very personal level. But at the same time, he has a very clear agenda that he seeks to pursue and sees Trump's calls for allies to do more as a good platform for him to carry out that agenda. So of all the leaders up there, it seems to me that he Abe is not just best positioned at a personal level, but also best positioned in terms of a policy agenda to engage with the new administration.
Let me pick up there. I think that's right. Abe has a particular knack for getting on well with people like Benjamin Netanyahu and Vladimir Putin and, strong leaders. He's not uncomfortable dealing with people like that. And so the dynamics from the meeting they had in New York, Trump and Abe, the dynamics seem to have been quite good from the Japanese perspective. The other thing is, Mr. Trump's comments on Japan were largely from the 80s. They were about 20, 30 years out of date. And the Japan of Abe is completely different. So one of President Trump's priorities is infrastructure, investment, job creation. Well, Japan's been the largest investor in the U.S. for 3 years running, is the largest creator of manufacturing jobs of any country in the world now inside the U.S. economy. More on defense, as you said, Victor. The Abe cabinet wants to spend more on defense. And when the new administration starts unpacking, defense guidelines, the review of the constitutional interpretation of collective self-defense and other things, there's more there. It's mostly going to be about, I think Japan's going to have to convince the U.S. side, or Abe's going to have to convince Mr. Trump, the definition of alliances should be more, as Andrew's pointed out elsewhere, than just how much you pay. It's how much risk are you taking, how much capability are you producing, and a lot of that is jointness. Japan has been separate and not very joint with the U.S. for decades. Now, under Abe, getting much more virtually joint and combined. Still not a reciprocal security arrangement like we have with Australia or Korea or NATO, but moving in that direction. So I think there are a lot of boxes he checks for Donald Trump's own agenda. The big bummer for Abe is TPP. And my sense is the Japanese government is going to be patient. I agree with Matt. I don't think they're going to go for a bilateral agreement. They'll find other ways to talk and wait for the right opportunity. The wild card is, and I think the Kante, the Prime Minister's office, is up at night over this one. They just find this new president so unpredictable. Could he suddenly announce we don't need Marines in Okinawa? Or I think Scott has made an argument this won't happen, but could he go off to the Great Wall and sort of come out and say the new model of great power relations is awesome? That could potentially really damage Abe, if given how much he's investing in the relationship. So to the earlier point, if you're looking for black swans that could undercut Mr. Abe, those are probably some of the ones. He is taking some risk leaning so far forward, and maybe the same is true for May in the UK, but that's not on our panel. But I think the dynamics, Abe's own history, his agenda just gel better than almost any leader in Asia, except perhaps Modi in India. So we'll have to see what Rick says about that. Duterte, Amy, he's not going to call Trump the son of a whatever. One assumes, but what should we expect?
Yeah, I think I agree with the audience in terms of the ranking here, with Duterte being this very intriguing possibility. When I was listening to Scott list the similarities of Xi Jinping and Trump, I, of course, was thinking about President Duterte, and he shares a lot of those similarities as well. So I suddenly had this image of three amigos or something. Look, there are a lot of similarities in personality, and they're both blunt talkers. They both sort of take glee in going after political opponents. There's a lot of similarities, it appears, in governing style, with a lot of pronouncements from the presidents, and the team kind of scrambling to figure out what that means and how to implement it if they're going to implement what is being said at the top. So there are some intriguing similarities there, and we know that there's already been some warm words exchanged between the two men in an introductory phone call, and reportedly Trump said some nice things about Duterte's war on drugs, which would be very near and dear to the President Duterte's heart. That's his #1 priority by far. But there's still a lot of human rights concerns around the war of drugs, and it does, one could plausibly think that the Trump administration is going to be less focused on human rights, and I think that's given a lot of encouragement to people in the Duterte regime that maybe they really can get off to a much better relationship. However, there are a few caveats here, a number of caveats actually. First, in terms of the human rights concerns over the drug war and the many extrajudicial killings that have taken place and are continuing apace, Mr. Trump is not the only person in this government who is going to have a say on the Philippines' human rights record and the kind of assistance that we give. Congress has a very large role to play, a very large voice in this issue, and there are some real bipartisan concerns up on the Hill. If any of you saw the Rex Tillerson confirmation hearings and Marco Rubio really going after him on the Philippines and the extrajudicial killings, the human rights concerns, that underscores the challenge that the Duterte administration is going to continue to face with Washington. And so one unanswered question is, if the Hill does come forth with a very strong pronouncement and perhaps some policy changes on the basis of their human rights concerns, how will Duterte react? Will he react against the United States in very emotional and bombastic language, as he has already done in the past, or will he separate out President Trump from Congress? Big unknown there. I also should say, by the way, this is not just a potential setting a new reset for this relationship between the two leaders, but we also have a new ambassador, Sung Kim, in Manila, who just arrived a couple of months ago, and a new ambassador from the Philippines that's going to come here to Washington around March or April. So there's other parts of the relationship that I think are in place for a potential kind of new beginning and getting over some of the rockiness of the past year, but there's still a lot of obstacles. The other big thing to flag is, of course, there's strategically, the two presidents appear to be moving in very different directions. So President Trump has signaled that he wants to get very tough on China on the South China Sea issues, whereas Duterte has really sought to soften disputes with China on the South China Sea and really engage China much more, engage Xi Jinping, who he does get along well with, it appears, on economic issues, in particular on seeking investment from China. So how that is going to play into a relationship between Trump and Duterte, I think, bears watching, and whether Duterte will recalculate at any point in time his strategic choices will be interesting. But there are a lot of minefields here, and the final thing just to raise is, I mean, realistically, how much time do we think that the Trump administration, that President Trump himself is going to want to spend on a Southeast Asian country? Perhaps if he sees the Philippines as really strategically important in the South China Sea, he will want to make that kind of investment. But when I look at this list and I see, people like Shinzo Abe and even Malcolm Turnbull on the list, I just wonder if there really is going to be that kind of investment on Duterte.
Okay, let's do the next clicker question. The Xi Jinping will not be removed in 2017, we think. Maybe Chris Johnson will come back and tell us otherwise. But there will be the 19th Party Congress, which will have pretty important implications for leadership down the road in China and the mix of leaders. So let's take a minute and pre-forecast what to expect. That's too bad. I found the soft push option intriguing. Nope. Okay, Scott?
Well, I'm going to have to agree, although, Xi Jinping is head of the leading small group on soccer reform, and that's not going too well. So it's possible that he could lose one job, although it's probably not the most important job in China. You remember Deng Xiaoping was head of the Bridge Club, which is the source of all political authority in China. I think, and again, I want to agree, and China has one of the most opaque political systems in the world, save perhaps for Washington. But and so it's always hard to predict. And if you just go back 5 years ago, at this time, where you thought it was going to be a smooth sailing and clear transition, you had the interesting case of Bo Xilai, who was vying for power, whose wife apparently had murdered a British citizen in China, which would not have been discovered except for the police chief of the city where Bo Xilai was in power, ran off to the U.S. consulate in Chengdu, spilled the beans, spilled more, and that just threw Chinese politics for several months into a tizzy. I don't expect we're going to see something like that now. You never know what's going on behind the scenes in China, but I think if there's anything like that, they're going to be much better at controlling it. The anti-corruption campaign, the reform of the military, the change of every general, almost every provincial leader has been changed in the last year, and so I expect relatively smooth sailing. I do think that there is unpredictability in how this is going to unfold, what the size of the new Politburo Standing Committee will be, whether it will stay at 7 or go up to 9, where it was before, or go down to 5, where it was beginning, where it was when Deng Xiaoping took power. There's also, it's unclear whether Xi Jinping will identify his likely successor or keep everyone in the dark and give them the impression that he might want to stay beyond 2022. So I do think that although we know that he's going to stay in power and he's going to appoint more allies, the number of those allies and what the future beyond this year brings, I think, is still going to be something that we're not going to get a lot of clarity on.
So when Amy said the only new person at a U.S.-ASEAN summit, if President Trump does one, will be President Trump, the only new person probably, if Mr. Trump goes to the East Asia Summit or APEC, around the rest of the table is going to be the Korean leader. So we're going to ask everyone to predict the outcome of the Korean election, handicap it, and then have Victor correct our thinking. The Korea, there we go. There actually is a scenario in D where Park Geun-hye could be at these summits. No one in the audience is buying it. What's your read, Victor?
So I was saying to somebody during the break that I was in Seoul the day before and the day of the inauguration here, and the front page photo of probably every newspaper in the world was the inauguration of President Trump, except in Korea, where the front page picture was J.Y. Lee of Samsung and whether he would be arrested by the Seoul District Court. I think that probably all of you are, the majority of you are correct that it'll probably be A, that she will be impeached, but, and that I think the polling at least shows that if the election were held today, it's most likely that the progressives would win. But overall, when we look at this situation, you know, on the one hand, I look at it and I think this is, you know, Korea is one of the most vibrant democracies in Asia, if not the world. This is a rough democracy, and it's democracy at work, where leaders are being held accountable by the people and by the law. Where you have on successive weekends hundreds of thousands of people coming out into the streets to express their political preferences, right? That's democracy. On the other hand, you have a very troubling power vacuum that has been in place now for a couple of months and is likely to continue, possibly through as late as August of this year, in which you have a society that is looking literally to tear down all the structures and institutions of power and wealth in the country. So it's, in that sense, it's quite troubling. In terms of the ramifications of this, I mean, I think we're already seeing, with this power vacuum in Korea, we're already seeing it impact certain things externally. The first thing it's impacting is the U.S.-Korea alliance in terms of the earlier decision to deploy terminal high-altitude area defense and missile defense system on the Korean Peninsula. The power vacuum in Korea, in conjunction with the transition here in the United States, has led China to be much more aggressive in terms of its pressing of South Korean politicians and businesses to try to walk back the decision on THAAD. I think we see it in the relationship with Japan in the sense that we saw the erection of a second Comfort Woman statue in Busan, which has led to the reigniting of an issue that had been bilaterally agreed upon between the two leaders that now has come back and started to affect the relationship. The Japanese ambassador was temporarily recalled in response to the statue. It's affecting business too, because I think when you have the prosecution going after all of South Korean business leaders to try to see if they are implicated in a corruption scandal involving the president, that does not do a lot for the business climate in the country and does not do a lot particularly for the conglomerates, the chaebols in Korea, who my guess are in very much of a wait-and-see mode when it comes to investing in their own country, and are doing probably like they did during the No Muhyun years, which is to be as liquid as possible, and if anything, to invest outside the country rather than inside the country. So for all these reasons, I think all of us want to see whatever decision is made by the Constitutional Court, that decision come as soon as possible, so that we can move on in this political process of Korea trying to, to stabilize itself in terms of its domestic situation.
Victor, jumping back to the earlier question, who will get along best with President Trump? If it is, and Korean elections, of course, are really hard to predict if you look back, but if it is a progressive government, presumably it's Moon Jae-in, but maybe not. But if it's Moon Jae-in, how would you see that relationship? You and I lived through the No Muhyun Bush years, and it was scratchy and tough on the surface. We actually got a lot done. So how would you look at a Moon Jae-in-Trump kind of combination?
I mean, it could be deja vu all over again, in the sense that as you said, on the surface it's quite scratchy, but in terms of results, actually that period between No Muhyun and President Bush was actually one of the most productive periods in the USARPAC alliance in terms of the free trade agreement, visa waiver, NATO +3 status for Korea, force base plans. I mean, there was a lot that was accomplished, and one of course hopes that similar sorts of accomplishments would happen in a Trump-Moon Jae-in relationship. But we just don't know. And like you said, Mike, we don't know what the outcome of the election will be. The typical algorithm is the side that wins is the one that can unify itself the most around one candidate instead of fielding 2 or 3 candidates. And there are a flurry of candidates on the progressive side that all want their shot. And right now, the only sort of conservative candidate that people are talking about is Ban Ki-moon, the former UN Secretary General. So we don't know at all what it's going to look like. What concerns me here in the United States and around the world is that there are many progressive candidates right now in South Korea, and they're not all saying the same thing. Some of them are saying things that are a lot more provocative and unprecedented than others, the far left to the center left. And my concern is that around the world, they're not going to know the difference between all these candidates. It's going to sound like they all are the same candidate on the left, in which case, coming into office, the popular impressions are going to be quite, they may be quite not in alignment with what the candidate actually wants to put forward as a platform. And so, at the start of every administration, first impressions are very important. The first encounter between the two, everybody on this stage can attest to, the first encounter between the two leaders is very important, and it can either push forward the relationship or it could set it back by 6 months to a year. What we say about Korea is that it's never boring. right? And that's certainly the case these days.
Speaking of leadership, I've done a poor job managing our time, but what I propose to do before we get into the maritime challenges is collect 2 or 3 questions and then let panel members answer as they wish. So please, up front here, Lily.
Hi, Sidney Friedberg, Breaking Defense. Following up on the THAAD question, but sort of opening the floor to everyone, we had General Brown of USARPAC here this morning talking about more exercises, more multilateral engagement between countries like Japan and Korea that historically didn't want anything to do with each other. With these leadership changes and turmoil on both sides of the Pacific, are those sort of steady working mill-to-mill things in jeopardy or just going to be on hold because they're politically sensitive? Or is that kind of stuff going to grind along at the working level while the politicians run around like headless chickens?
Thanks. Others? Okay, let's do, and this particularly I think is for Andrew and Victor and Amy. What happens to mill-to-mill relationships? Does the political change or the political dynamics within the region mess up what General Brown wants to do, or Admiral Harris and others?
Sure. From my point of view, there's a very strong secular trend here that's been underway for a long time, I would argue over a decade. And some of the trends that Mike was outlining earlier in the morning and others have talked about, including General Brown, are very strong. They're very powerful. They're driven by threats. And if you look around, guess what? The threat's not going away. The North Korea threat in particular is going to be a real driver of closer integration between the US and Korea, but also Japan and Korea, in my view, and probably others, including Australia. So I think we are going to get sort of surface noise and chop, but fundamentally, absent some remarkable change in the trajectory of the North Korea threat and China's military modernisation and assertiveness, I see defence integration continue.
I'm going to go Victor next, but I think if you look at the cabinet forming here, of all the agencies, DOD is likely to be most solid and continuous. I would predict that US, Japan, US, Australia, and trilateral will actually not continue, but accelerate considerably in the coming years. That's what I would guess. The Korea question, I think, is a bit more of a wild card, and then we'll do Southeast Asia.
So I think, North Korea is always the country that you can rely on to pull your chestnuts out of the fire, in the sense that the United States prior to the Korean War was gravitating towards a purely maritime strategy for Asia. That's the way George Kennan thought about it. And then we had the Korean War, and it completely changed overnight the U.S. grand strategy for the Asia Pacific. And in that sense, I would put a pretty good bet that North Korea is going to do something as this new administration gets started. And there's nothing like a crisis to help focus leadership on who are your friends and allies and who that you share interest with in dealing with that crisis, and who are the ones that are not your friends and allies. And so I think in that sense, there is, as Andrew said, a secular trend, and this is going to be augmented, I think, and accelerated by the sorts of threats and crises that come down the road. I think North Korea is going to be one of the first crises for this administration. And that will be a spur to greater cooperation, military cooperation, integrated alliance cooperation, as Andrew, Mike, and as General mentioned this morning. So it wouldn't surprise me if things moved in that direction. The press is reporting now that General Mattis is likely to make a trip to the region soon, and that would be a great opportunity, at least in Korea, to sort of set a path forward for the new administration in the United States and the administration to come in South Korea in terms of what U.S. expectations are in terms of alliance exercising and overall cooperation.
As General Brown put very well this morning, I mean, there really has been a dramatic rise in a lot of the mill-to-mill stuff we're doing in the region, in Southeast Asia in particular, and a lot of multilateral ways that we're engaging on exercises and training and other things. And I think that will continue because it is very much driven by the working level, and there's mutual interest. But the big exception to some degree is the Philippines, which has stepped back a little bit from some things that it is indicated it does not want to do with the United States, namely amphibious exercises and a small amount of small components of the Balikatan, the big bilateral annual exercise that we do with the Philippines. So whether the Philippines wants to reverse itself will be and step back up to a fully robust alliance engagement like we had prior to President Duterte remains to be seen. But that's even given that small setback, there's still a lot we're doing with the Philippines. And more broadly, with so many other countries, Malaysia, Vietnam, many other countries in the region, we're doing more and more things with them on the mill-to-mill level than we ever did before. Even before the election, there was a slight trend line away from that, or at least a deceleration of some of the growing engagement, as we saw countries like not only the Philippines, but Malaysia and others step back slightly from some of the things that they had previously indicated they wanted to do with the United States. So I think it'll be incumbent on the Trump administration to try to continue the momentum to keep things going forward with these countries in the region. And just to circle back to the first panel, the death of TPP really is a blow in this regard because, as Ash Carter said, TPP is worth to him another aircraft carrier because of the strategic significance, the sense that the United States is really committed in the region to showing up and being a real leader there. And so I do think it is going to have not a dramatic impact, but it's going to have to some degree a long-term negative impact on the way countries in the region view the benefit of even a security partnership with the United States.
So we're going to transition to the next panel, but let's thank this panel and invite the next team up. Thanks. While Bonnie and Zach Cooper come up, I just want to pick up on Amy's last comment and segue to the next topic. Amy and Jeff Hartman here have done a piece we just have out today, which you'll find, which called First Principles, some fundamental strategic principles on how the new administration should approach the South China Sea problem. And it's sort of getting back to the framework we'll need to deal with this problem, which we'll talk about in more detail now with Bonnie Glaser and Zach Cooper. Copies are available outside. So also, let me advertise very quickly, I should have earlier, with a Smith-Richardson grant, we have been looking at the nature of coercion in the maritime domain in the Western Pacific. And Zach Cooper and Jake Douglas here and a group of us have done very detailed case studies of Scarborough Shoals, the Japan-China collisions around the Senkakus, and really trying to break down blow by blow what happened, why, and draw some lessons about how this gray zone, hybrid warfare, phase zero, whatever you call it, this maritime use of non-kinetic coercion and sometimes a little bit kinetic coercion, how it's working and not working, and what our approach tells us about our own lessons and how to have a better strategy. And we're rolling that out sometime in March, April. It's a quite detailed study with a very short readable lessons learned part. All right, so we're going to talk about what the panelists and you think China might do in the South China Sea, and then in the East China Sea, and then the last question is going to be, overall, what are the dynamics going to be on these maritime problems, including the success or not of U.S. and Chinese approaches. So let's start with the first question, which is in the South China Sea. What will China do in 2017? It kind of goes from good to bad from a U.S. perspective. Sorry, from bad to good from a U.S. perspective. Okay, so the consensus, or at least the two-thirds of the audience, seems to expect something like what we see now, which is a stable equilibrium or a calm before the storm. We don't know that will continue. So why don't you guys unpack that? We'll start with you, Bonnie.
Well, I agree with that choice, Mike, for several reasons. Of course, Scott Kennedy has already talked about the fact that China wants to have a good, stable relationship with the United States. You're the 19th Party Congress, and in fact, as you said, may want to cut a deal so that it can keep the new type of major power relationship intact. I think China has clear goals and a strategy with some flexibility in the South China Sea, but there really is no timetable. The Chinese know what they want. They want more effective control over the sea space and the airspace, probably a longer-term goal of maybe even taking back some of those islands that they say others have stolen. But I don't see them trying to push that agenda this year. So I would say that China is going to be trying to avoid a provocation with the United States in the South China Sea, but if provoked, and of course, definitions of provocation vary, but if they perceive that they are provoked, then there is the potential for a strong pushback. Having said that, it is evident, as we know from our AMTI imagery and analysis, that the Chinese continue to militarize these outposts, that they have a large number of hardened shelters for aircraft, and I think it is only a matter of time before they actually start deploying some aircraft out there, possibly for exercises. We may see the SAMs, which the Chinese have on occasion deployed out in the Paracels on Woody Island, may be deployed on one of these islands in the South China Sea. And I would just comment on the, concluding a binding code of conduct with ASEAN. What the deadline this year is, or at least the agreement is, to conclude a framework agreement. So we don't know what that's going to look like. Big question as to whether it's going to be binding. But I think the challenge is to just create something that's more effective than the 2002 Code of Conduct.
So that's really helpful in framing it. So if I can push you to do a binary choice, would you say 2017 is the year where we begin to see the possibility of a new strategic equilibrium? Or is 2017 a little bit of a pause on a trajectory that will continue at some point? Or see none of the above?
I'm going to take a stand. I see it as a pause. I do not think we're going to see a new strategic equilibrium. I think that the Chinese will look for opportunities, if they can, to conduct land reclamation at Scarborough Shoal. I think there's a lot of people in the security services in the PLA who would like to do that, because otherwise the Chinese don't have the coverage of the entire South China Sea. They're sort of left nude or naked in the northeastern part. And, an ADIS, of course, is something they've long talked about. But before we see an ADIS, I think we will see baselines established in the Spratlys. That is likely to happen first. We saw that pattern in the East China Sea. Many people in China have told me that they're still discussing what those baselines would look like. And I think this is not the year for China to come out and do that. After the 19th Party Congress, then that may be possible in Xi Jinping's second term.
I agree very much with what Bonnie said, and I agree with the group as well. When we asked this question, we asked what China would do in the South China Sea in 2017, and actually I think that's almost the easier question to answer than what the United States might do. We've seen from the Chinese a fairly consistent moving out, an effort to increase control in the East China Seas and South China Seas little by little over time, and basically what you've projected is that will continue in 2017. I think the question that we don't know the answer to is how assertive will the new U.S. administration be in pushing back against the Chinese in the South China Sea or potentially the East China Sea or elsewhere, and would that change Chinese behavior in some important ways, maybe earlier in the year, but even potentially later in the year, depending on the political dynamics that evolve.
Let's turn to the East China Sea, the Senkaku Diaoyu problem. And these are not unrelated, of course, but Japan's a very different, problem for Beijing to tackle compared to the smaller players in the South China Sea. So why don't you all vote, and then we'll get Bonnie and Zach's assessment. By the way, these are not mutually exclusive, which maybe we can talk about. We only get 5 questions. Okay, Bonnie, why don't you start us off and include the possibility of all or many of the above?
Well, if we look at the option A, sail a naval vessel inside the territorial sea, I think the Chinese would only do that if they saw Japan taking an action that they viewed as very provocative. So, for example, if the Japanese were to start conducting joint patrols with the U.S. Navy in the South China Sea inside, 12 nautical miles of Chinese occupied features, one possible response by the Chinese would essentially be to send Navy vessels inside the 12 nautical miles around the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. So Japan is the variable, I think, in that particular one. I think unprovoked, the Chinese are not going to do that. We've seen a lot of activity around the disputed line in the East China Sea. The Chinese have been doing more on the gas drilling. Japan protested last June that China had installed radar equipment on gas exploration platforms, and there has been an uptick in that activity. So my guess is that's going to go on. I don't see any reason why the Chinese are necessarily going to pause on that score. I guess the last thing I'd like to say is that the Japanese are doing a lot to strengthen deterrence in the East China Sea. So we see Japan increasing the Coast Guard budget to $210 billion. They're introducing 8 new ships, including surveillance ships as well as research vessels. 200 law enforcement officials that will be added, and enlarging the port at Ishigaki. And so these actions really might, at least for a short-term period, because ultimately the balance of power does probably favor China over the long run, but at least for the time being, I see the potential to strengthen deterrence, and I think these are very good moves by Japan.
Terrific, thanks. Zach?
Yeah, I think that's basically right, and the Japanese moves in Ishigaki and elsewhere in the short term are going to be very stabilizing. They give Japan the ability to at least counter some of these types of scenarios. And there's another reason that if I was sitting in Beijing, I might not want to push on the East China Sea right now, which is that it could actually push the U.S.-Japan alliance closer together. And maybe this is not the time to do that. Whereas in the South China Sea, clearly there's more division. Malaysia, Philippines, real challenges for the United States, and some real tricky legal challenges in the South China Sea as well. Whereas in the East China Sea, U.S. positions have been more clear. And I think that's one of the reasons that over the last few years, we've actually seen East China Sea be relatively calm compared to the type of activity that we've seen from the Chinese in the South China Sea. So the division here, I think, reflects a little bit of uncertainty about what might happen. Whereas, in the South China Sea, I think you have general agreement about where the trends are heading. In the East China Sea, sure, any of these sort of events could happen, but I don't see any one as particularly more likely than the others. So I agree with the crowd on this one as well.
Okay, last one, we'll start with you, Zach, but let's vote first, is overall, and here the U.S. is an important variable, as Zach pointed out, as are third, parties that are more directly involved. I guess third is not the way to describe them, but the claimants. So overall, how do you see the geopolitics of Asia Maritime disputes unfolding this year? Again, not mutually exclusive, necessarily. Some may be, but you could have some of these things happening at the same time. So boy, the audience seems to expect more clout for Beijing and a pause by Beijing, which I suspect are two pieces of the same puzzle if this is where this heads. This also doesn't seem to give the U.S. a lot of credit for a smart or strong policy, but maybe that's wrong. So Zach, tell us.
I'm a bit surprised by the answer here. I would have thought that some larger percentage would have thought that FONOPS would have occurred. Maybe the issue here is the wording of the question, which is not just robust FONOPS, which I think are likely, but successful FONOPS.
Spell out FONOPS.
Right, freedom of navigation operations, which get to the question of what is the point of the freedom of navigation operations? What are we actually trying to do if we continue or enhance this program? And I think that's a core question here. Are the freedom of navigation operations intended simply to continue flying, sailing, and operating wherever international law allows? Or, as was interpreted by many in the public, are they in some way a response to land reclamation? In which case, I think the likelihood that we're going to see rollback of land reclamation by having more freedom of navigation operations is very low. So I find that answer interesting. I also do agree that this pause as Beijing weighs the administration's intentions. We've already seen a little bit of that, I think. I've been surprised about how restrained the Chinese commentary has been the last week or so over some of the South China Sea issues. And I think that portrays a bit of an interest on Beijing's part in waiting and seeing exactly which direction the Trump administration is going to go, how forcefully it will push, and exactly what kind of actions they're likely to take before they take a hard line in responding.
And for more on that, stay tuned for our report in, I keep saying March, you keep saying, no, April.
Spring.
On, very detailed recreations of the confrontations we've had and what is effective coercion and what is effective counter-coercion. Yep.
Yeah, and just one point on this. So the study that we've done looks at 9 cases of coercive incidents from 2009 to today. And I think one important caveat to the common view, I think there's this argument that the Chinese push often in the East China Sea and South China Sea, and that they're always successful in these coercive challenges. Actually, we look at 9 cases, and 2 of them we code as pure coercive successes. And those are 2 very important cases, don't get me wrong. Scarborough Shoal in 2012 and land reclamation generally. But we have 7 cases that are mixed outcomes, where the Chinese either don't get what they want, or they get part of what they want, but clearly not all of what they were hoping for. And I think that's important to remember as we think about this question, because it means that not only the United States, but that claimants actually have been and can be successful in pushing back on Chinese coercion, despite the power differentials. So, turn it back over to Bonnie.
Well, I think I've already explained why I think there will be somewhat of a pause, so I think C is correct. I'm not surprised that a lot of people voted for A as well, because I think that big question is, in what direction are countries going to hedge? Are they going to see the United States as very engaged in the region, whether or not we use the term rebalance, but working with the region, continuing our maritime security initiative and bolstering countries' capabilities to have maritime domain awareness, diplomatically engage in the region, whether we'll have an economic strategy, or is there going to be a sense that the U.S. is pulling back a bit, maybe not as committed, and then some countries at least hedging a bit in the direction of China. And that would provide more clout for Beijing. And we have just seen about a week or so ago, the Chinese issued a new white paper on Asia-Pacific security, which is interesting and, of course, important to just note the title. They're not, at least explicitly, talking about Asia. They're talking about Asia-Pacific. And so they're trying to find some way that maybe throw a bone to signal that the U.S. would be
or they're expanding.
Included. Or they're expanding, right. And I would comment also on E, and we do have 15% of people who voted for that, about the increased danger of a direct U.S.-China clash. And it's probably worth mentioning that there has been a lot of conflicting signals, and that's probably a nice way of putting it. Maybe muddled statements is more accurate by the incoming Trump administration. And we had, of course, in the confirmation hearing for Rex Tillerson, this suggestion that the United States might, in fact, seek to deny China access to these military outposts, and comments by the press spokesman of the White House, Spicer, that, in my view, tried to walk that back a bit, but still not clear. If the U.S. were to really take that kind of a stance in the South China Sea, then I think you do have the potential for a direct clash. I mean, if we have a blockade around an island and a Chinese aircraft comes flying in, are we really going to shoot it down? And my guess is no. But there is really, I think, the potential there for if the U.S. tries to look tough, and in the year of the 19th Party Congress, then Xi Jinping feels that he has to look tough as well.
I think if there could be a mulligan on this one, instead of, the spokesman trying to walk back or, contextualize what Rex Tillerson said, my guess would be, and I'm not involved in the transition, I'm just saying this from the outside, but my guess would be the denial of these air bases in the South China Sea as a bastion for the PLA, or dominance of the South China Sea, which is a much more broad statement. Generally, it's not a good idea to have strategic clarity in a situation like that, but to have tactical clarity of your capabilities. And what Mr. Spicer did, I think, was add a little bit more ambiguity. Maybe we'll end up in a place where that ambiguity, although it will cause uneasiness in Beijing, might be useful. But I see that as not a declaratory statement of U.S. strategy or policy, and the beginning of an interesting series of clarifications, or actually obfuscations, and then intense dialogue between the U.S. and China. And in the U.S.-China relations,
I think you're being very generous in your interpretation here.
I'm being hopeful.
Yeah.
And in the history of U.S.-China relations, as you know, Bonnie, the opening administration's opening statements, whether it was Reagan or George W. Bush, can cause a lot of friction. I'm not saying this will necessarily happen this time, but with both Reagan and Bush, initial statements on Taiwan or policies on Taiwan created great kerfuffles, real concern.
Yep.
They were deftly managed by both sides, and in the end, those administrations, I think by most metrics, public opinion, cooperation, lack of conflict with China, those actually were the administrations that had the most stable and productive U.S.-China relationships. So I guess I'm not willing to accept that that's a declared policy of this new administration that increases the risk of war. I think it's a work in progress, and don't know where it will go, but if it's deftly managed going forward, it's actually not necessarily where we're going to go. So I apologize, we ran a bit over, and you can corner people on the way out a little bit maybe, although we have a meeting afterwards. Let me just say thank you. What we try to do with this Asia forecast, as in much of what we do here, is to do what General Brown said, embrace the complexity. And the TPP is related to the dissuasion and deterrence strategy, which is related to the political leadership and domestic dynamics. And we've tried to kind of embrace that and put it all up on the board and let you vote on it and help us think it through. And we really appreciate you doing it, and hope you'll participate in or come to some of our projects over the coming year. Thank you, Bonnie and Zach. Thank you all.